A mother's son, found half in the sand and half in the water, on a beach where the current barely reaches your ankles. She didn't need a coroner to tell her it was him. She knew it the second the phone rang. What she didn't know yet was that 2 medical examiners would look at that boy's body and still not be able to explain a deep red marking underneath the skin at the back of his head. Tonight, for the first time, hear it in the words of the one man who was actually in the room for all of it, the man who sat with her on the gravel while she cried, and stood beside her in a coroner's conference room while a stranger in a quiet voice tried to tell her gently that the person on the table down the hall was her boy. Before we ever get to the mother, the search commander, or the coroner's conference room, understand what set this entire broadcast in motion. A forensic pathologist on the panel, a woman named Dr. Kendall Crowns, was asked directly whether that marking on the back of Nolan's head could simply be explained away, and her answer was not the reassurance a lot of viewers expected. Could it be a decompositional change, she was asked. Could it be something else like blunt force injury? Her response, in essence, was that it's genuinely hard to say at this point in time. Not a dismissal, not a confirmation, an honest acknowledgement that the physical evidence as it stood didn't allow for a confident answer either way. And when that same question was put a second time, the response sharpened into something closer to disbelief. It is very difficult to accept that not one, but 2 separate medical examiners looked at the same deep red subcutaneous marking and still couldn't explain it. That's the tension this entire episode sits inside. A credentialed forensic professional on camera, declining to simply wave away a physical finding that doesn't have an easy explanation yet, which is precisely why this case has stayed open in the public conversation as long as it has. It's worth understanding what that credential actually represents, because medical examiner and forensic pathologist get used loosely in casual conversation, but describe a genuinely demanding professional path. Becoming a board-certified forensic pathologist requires completing medical school, followed by a residency in anatomic and clinical pathology, followed by an additional dedicated fellowship specifically in forensic pathology, followed by board certification through the American Board of Pathology. A training pipeline that typically runs well over a decade from the start of medical school to independent practice. Someone at that level of training has, by the time they're sitting on a panel like this one, personally performed or reviewed autopsies numbering in the hundreds or thousands, across an enormous range of causes and manners of death, which is exactly why a forensic pathologist's plain refusal to offer a confident, easy explanation for a specific finding carries real weight rather than reading as evasiveness. Someone with that depth of pattern recognition experience saying, "It's hard to say," about a specific marking is a meaningfully different statement than an untrained observer saying the same words. Her name is Christine. Her son's name was Nolan Wells. And before you decide what you think happened to him, you should know exactly what his mother went through just to be told his name back to her. It started, like so many of the worst days of people's lives do, as an ordinary morning. Nolan had gone out to Horn Island for the 4th of July, the way a lot of people up and down that stretch of the Mississippi Gulf Coast do every year. Horn Island is a barrier island, no roads, no bridges, nothing but sand and scrub pine and water on every side. And on the 4th it fills up with boats rafted together, coolers, music, families and friends celebrating the way people have celebrated on that island for generations. It sits within Gulf Island's national seashore, a stretch of barrier islands managed as protected federal wilderness, which is part of why it has no permanent development, no docks, no facilities beyond what nature put there, reachable only by private boat, a genuinely wild, undeveloped stretch of coastline that has drawn boaters for the 4th of July for as long as anyone can remember, precisely because it offers open beach and open water without a single commercial structure in sight. He was there with friends. That's what his mother told the man who would spend the next several days searching for him. He was there with friends, and then, at some point on the 4th of July, he wasn't anywhere anyone could find. The same remoteness that makes Horn Island beautiful, no roads, no bridges, is exactly what makes any emergency there so much harder to respond to than one on the mainland just a few miles away. There's no ambulance that can simply drive to the scene. No land-based rescue crew can walk in. Every single resource, whether it's a first responder, a search boat, or a medical evacuation, has to cross open Gulf water to get there and back, which adds real, unavoidable time to every stage of a response, time that, in a true medical emergency, can be the difference the outcome turns on entirely. That's part of the specific, sobering context behind an island that fills with celebratory crowds every 4th of July. It's a genuinely wonderful place to spend a holiday, And it's also a place where help, if something goes wrong, is never as close as it feels standing on that beach in the sun. Nobody on that beach on the 4th of July was thinking about response times. Nobody ever does until the day they need one. Think too about those friends, the ones who were actually there, who spent that day on the water with Nolan and then had to somehow process the fact that at some unknown point that day, he simply stopped being with them. There's an entire separate category of grief researchers describe as survivor's presence guilt, distinct from the more commonly discussed survivor's guilt of someone who lived through a shared, singular dangerous event. This is the specific, gnawing burden carried by people who were present for the ordinary, unremarkable hours before a tragedy, who keep replaying the day afterward searching for the exact moment they should have noticed something was wrong, should have counted heads, should have asked one more question. Those friends did not cause whatever happened to Nolan, but they will very likely spend a long time quietly and privately believing they should have, which is its own form of collateral damage this kind of case leaves behind, one that rarely gets any airtime at all because it isn't the family, it isn't the searchers, and it isn't the investigators. It's a group of young people who went out on the water on a holiday to have a good time with a friend, and came home instead into the middle of the worst thing that's ever happened to someone they love. Those same friends will also, almost certainly, become witnesses in whatever formal investigation follows, which raises its own set of general challenges investigators know well. Interviewing traumatized witnesses reliably is a specialized skill, and a poorly conducted interview, one that asks leading questions, one that pressures a witness toward a specific narrative, or one conducted too soon before a witness has had any chance to process what happened, can genuinely corrupt the very memory it's trying to extract, a well-documented risk in memory research. Trained investigators generally use structured techniques, sometimes called cognitive interviewing, that ask a witness to reconstruct a timeline in their own words, from multiple different starting points and in different orders, specifically because this method has been shown to surface more accurate, more complete detail than a simple, direct question and answer format, without introducing the kind of subtle suggestion that can distort a witness's account without them ever realizing it happened. Getting those interviews right with Nolan's friends, with anyone else present on Horn Island that day, may end up mattering as much to how this case ultimately resolves as any single piece of physical evidence recovered from the scene itself. Christine didn't wait. By the time volunteer search and rescue crews were fully mobilized, she had already been on the phone, already been in contact with a man named Josh Gill, the incident commander for the United Cajun Navy, a search and rescue and disaster response organization built out of ordinary boat owners who go out and look for people when the water takes them. Josh Gill would later describe getting that call from Christine directly, a mother's voice on the other end of the line early on a Sunday morning, 7:30, asking for help finding her son. He said he does what he always does in that moment. He starts memorializing the conversation, writing down what's said because a missing person search runs on details, and every detail she gave him about Nolan, about who he was with, about where he'd been, became a thread the search teams could pull on. That habit, memorializing every conversation in real time, is standard practice across serious search and rescue and investigative work generally, and it matters for a reason that goes well beyond simple organization. In the earliest hours of any missing persons case, family members are operating under extreme stress, and small details, a place name, a friend's nickname, and approximate time can shift or blur in memory within days, sometimes within hours, entirely unintentionally. A contemporaneous written record, taken at the moment information is first given, becomes the most reliable version of that information available to investigators later, more reliable even than the same family member's own memory of what they said, once time and trauma have had a chance to reshape it. It's also, practically, a form of protection for the family themselves. If a detail Christine gave that morning ever becomes relevant to a formal investigation down the line, a contemporaneous record exists showing exactly what she said and when, rather than relying on anyone's memory months or years later, of a conversation that happened in the worst hours of her life. Before we go further, it's worth sitting with what that phone call actually is, because if you've never made one, it's almost impossible to imagine. This isn't a call to a friend to ask if they've seen your son's car in the driveway. This is a mother dialing a stranger's number because she has decided, before anyone official has confirmed anything, that the only path forward is to build her own search operation out of whoever will pick up the phone. Mothers who have lived through a missing child, even for a few hours, describe a specific and totally involuntary shift that happens in their body. The part of the brain that handles ordinary problems goes quiet, and something older and more animal takes over, an engine that exists for exactly one purpose, which is finding the child, and it does not stop, does not sleep, does not accept comfort until the child is found. Josh Gill, a man who has done this kind of work for a long time, called it mother's intuition. He said it more than once in more than one context over the course of describing that day. He meant it as something close to a diagnosis. He watched a woman behave from the very first phone call, like someone who already knew, on some level beneath conscious thought, what the search was going to find. Search and rescue operations for a missing swimmer or boater are built around a boat launch, a staging area, because that's where the equipment goes in the water and where the agencies coordinate. For this search, that was the Lake Mars boat launch. Josh Gill deployed a fixed-wing aircraft that morning, wheels up at 0635, before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon, while he himself drove toward the staging area to set up what he called the Tactical Operations Center. It's worth understanding briefly why a fixed-wing aircraft is often the very first resource deployed in a water search, ahead of boats, ahead of divers, ahead of almost anything else. From altitude, a spotter can cover enormous stretches of coastline and open water in a fraction of the time it would take a boat crawling along the surface, scanning for something as specific as a color that doesn't belong against sand or waves, an object floating where the current would naturally carry it, or simply a pattern in the water that looks different from the surrounding texture. Early morning hours like the 0635 wheels up time here aren't arbitrary either. Low-angle morning light reduces glare off the water's surface compared to midday sun, giving aerial spotters meaningfully better visibility in exactly the hours right after a search begins, when time matters most and when a person, if still alive, has the best chance of being found in time. Once an aerial search narrows a general area, water search and rescue teams typically shift to a structured surface search, usually a grid pattern, dividing open water into defined lanes that multiple boats can each cover systematically, specifically to avoid the two most common failure modes of an unstructured search: gaps nobody actually covers, and the same stretch of water searched redundantly by multiple boats while another stretch goes completely unchecked. Divers are typically deployed only once a surface or aerial search has narrowed the search area meaningfully, both because underwater visibility searches are exhausting and dangerous work with real limits on how much water a diver can physically cover, and because sending divers in before narrowing the search geographically wastes exactly the kind of time that matters most in the earliest hours. This layered structure, aircraft first for the broadest coverage, boats next in a systematic grid, divers last once an area is narrowed, is standard practice across professional and volunteer water search and rescue operations alike, and it's the structure Josh Gill was operating inside of that morning as the incident commander, coordinating every layer of it simultaneously. Volunteer dive teams operating within organizations like this typically hold recognized civilian certifications, open water and advanced open water diving credentials at minimum, with many public safety-focused volunteer divers pursuing additional specialized training in swift water rescue, search pattern technique, and underwater recovery specifically, distinct from recreational diving certification. That additional training matters enormously in open Gulf water, where visibility can be reduced to a few feet or less depending on sediment, current, and time of day, conditions that make an untrained diver's search pattern effectively useless, and can turn a recovery dive into a genuine safety hazard for the diver as well. An incident commander's job, in the middle of coordinating aircraft, boats, and eventually divers, includes making a real-time judgment call about exactly when conditions and available information justify committing a diver to the water at all, balancing the urgency of the search against the very real risk to the volunteer being asked to go under. He was roughly 15 minutes out when his phone rang again. This time it wasn't Christine. It was the sheriff's department, telling him a body had been found. They didn't say whose. They couldn't have, not yet, not with any certainty. But within minutes of that call, before he'd even reached the boat launch, his phone rang a third time, and this time it was Christine, and she was frantic. He would later say, choosing his words carefully because he understood exactly how much weight they carried, that in that moment his biggest concern wasn't managing information. It was making sure she was physically safe, that she had someone to drive her, that she wasn't going to get behind a wheel in the state she was in and become a second emergency layered on top of the first. That's worth pausing on because it tells you something true about what a search and rescue incident commander actually does in the field. It isn't only logistics and radios and GPS coordinates. It's also, constantly, quietly, managing the raw human wreckage that a missing persons case leaves in its wake, sometimes before there's even confirmation of what happened. When Christine arrived at the boat launch, she got out of the vehicle and ran straight to Josh Gill. Not to the sheriff's deputy standing nearby, not to her own husband first, but to the man she had built a working relationship with over the phone in the hours before, the man who represented in that moment the only active effort being made to bring her son home. She hugged him and started crying, and he started crying with her, and the two of them sat down right there on the gravel of the parking lot and stayed there for roughly 15 minutes. Sit with that image for a second, because it is the emotional center of gravity for everything that follows. Not a hospital room, not a courtroom, not a press conference podium. A gravel parking lot at a boat ramp, a mother and a stranger who had become, out of pure necessity, one of the most important people in her life that week, sitting on the ground together because neither of them could physically stand. He said her husband was there too, standing over both of them with a hand on each of their shoulders, a quiet stoic presence who didn't say much but whose steadiness, in Josh Gill's telling, held the whole scene together. 3 people on a gravel lot, one of them praying out loud, one of them silent and solid, one of them crying and asking God why, over and over, the most basic and least answerable question a human being can ask. It's worth pausing specifically on the father, because his grief in this scene is easy to read as simply less than his wife's, when the more accurate read is that it looked different, not smaller. Grief researchers who study gendered patterns of mourning have long documented what's sometimes called instrumental grieving, a style more commonly, though not exclusively, observed in men, characterized by channeling loss into action, physical presence, and problem-solving rather than open emotional expression, standing guard, keeping a hand on a shoulder, making sure everyone is physically safe, rather than crying in a parking lot. It is not evidence of loving a child less, and it is not evidence of denial. It's simply a different, equally legitimate route through the same unbearable event, one that can be easy for outside observers, and sometimes even for the person's own family, to misread as coldness or detachment, when what's actually happening is a father holding himself together, quite literally, so that everyone around him has something solid to lean on. Josh Gill said he prayed with her right there on the ground. Not a private, silent prayer, but an out-loud one, a prayer for peace and comfort first, and only then a prayer for God's speed if the body they'd find turned out to be Nolan's. He was careful in describing it later, to say that he wasn't praying that it wasn't Nolan exactly, because by that point neither of them, in their heart, believed that was a real possibility left on the table. He was praying for what comes after the worst thing you can imagine actually happens. That's a distinction almost nobody thinks about until they're the one living it. There's a phase of hoping a tragedy isn't real, and there's a separate later phase, sometimes arriving within the very same hour, when hope quietly closes up shop and what's left is only the question of how you're going to survive knowing. Most people, mercifully, never have to locate the exact moment that shift happens inside themselves. Christine located it on a gravel lot in under 15 minutes, with a near stranger's arms around her and a stranger's prayer in her ear, because the human body, it turns out, does not wait for permission to know what it already knows. Researchers who study coping and resilience after traumatic loss have consistently found that religious and spiritual practice, prayer specifically among them, functions as one of the more robust, measurable protective factors available to grieving people, across faiths and across cultures. It isn't simply anecdotal comfort. Studies following bereaved parents and family members over time have found that those who engage in regular prayer or communal religious practice after a sudden loss report, on average, lower rates of complicated or prolonged grief disorder, a clinical diagnosis describing grief so persistent and disabling it interferes with basic daily functioning well beyond what's typically expected. Researchers offer a few overlapping explanations for why. Prayer provides a structured outlet for expressing otherwise unbearable emotion, a sense of shared burden with something larger than oneself, and critically, a built-in community of fellow believers who show up consistently in the weeks and months after the initial crisis has faded from everyone else's attention. Whatever a person's own relationship to faith, watching Josh Gill and Christine pray together on that gravel lot wasn't just an act of comfort in the moment. By the evidence, it was very likely doing real, measurable psychological work. That single prayer on the gravel didn't stay contained to 2 people either. Faith communities across the country have long organized what's commonly called a prayer chain, an informal but often remarkably fast-moving network where a specific request for prayer, for a missing child, a sick relative, a family in crisis, gets passed from person to person, congregation to congregation, sometimes reaching thousands of people within days through nothing more than phone calls, text threads, and word of mouth. It's a low-tech, entirely decentralized system, and it's also functionally one of the original crowdsourced support networks, predating anything resembling social media by generations. When Josh Gill later asked on air for anyone listening to keep Christine in their prayers, and later still when Christine turned around and asked for prayers for a different family entirely, both of them were participating in exactly this kind of network, one built on the simple, repeatedly documented premise that knowing large numbers of strangers are actively holding you in mind during the worst period of your life provides something real, even to people who might struggle to articulate exactly what that something is. This is a good place to pause the narrative and talk, in general terms, about what grief researchers and hospice and crisis workers have documented, over and over, in the earliest minutes of a traumatic loss. None of what follows is a claim about Christine specifically, or a diagnosis of her state of mind. It's general context, drawn from decades of published research on acute grief and trauma response, offered so you can understand why the scene Josh Gill described looks the way it looks. In the first minutes after someone receives catastrophic news about a loved one, before any formal confirmation, a significant portion of people report something researchers call anticipatory grief collapsing into acute grief in real time. The emotional work of bracing for terrible news and the emotional work of actually absorbing it happen almost simultaneously, which is part of why bystanders often describe the person as behaving with unnerving calm one moment and complete physical collapse the next. The body's stress response floods the system with cortisol and adrenaline, which is why people in this state often report time distorting, sounds becoming muffled or unnaturally sharp, and physical sensations like their legs simply refusing to hold them up, which is likely a meaningful part of why Josh Gill had to help Christine physically stand back up off the gravel 15 or 20 minutes later. It is not weakness. It is a documented, near-universal physiological response to a category of news the human nervous system did not evolve to process gracefully. Acute grief isn't only an emotional event. It's a measurable physical one, with real documented effects on the cardiovascular system specifically. Cardiologists have a recognized clinical name for one extreme version of this: stress cardiomyopathy, sometimes called broken heart syndrome, a condition in which a sudden, severe emotional shock triggers a temporary, dramatic weakening of the heart muscle, producing symptoms that in the moment can look and feel almost identical to an actual heart attack, complete with chest pain and shortness of breath, even in people with no prior cardiac history at all. It's rare, but it's real, well documented in cardiology literature, and cardiologists specifically associate it with exactly the kind of sudden catastrophic news a family in this position receives. Less dramatically, but far more commonly, researchers studying bereavement have documented measurable, temporary increases in blood pressure, disrupted sleep architecture, and suppressed immune function in the weeks immediately following a sudden loss. All of it a physical echo of the same nervous system flood that put Christine on the ground in that parking lot. None of this is offered to suggest Christine has experienced any of these specific effects. It's general, established medical context, offered because it's worth understanding that a grieving parent in this position is not only carrying an emotional burden. Their body, in a very literal and measurable sense, is under genuine physical strain in the exact same window of time everyone around them is focused entirely on the emotional and logistical crisis in front of them. After those 15 minutes on the ground, the sheriff's staff came over more than once, according to Josh Gill, and recognized what was happening, and gave the three of them room. Eventually, and he used the phrase, "I hate to say she caught her composure," because composure isn't really the right word for what happens to a person in that moment, Christine stood back up, with his help, and family and friends began arriving at the boat launch. Security let them through. That details security screening who could and couldn't get near the family at the boat launch is a small logistical fact that deserves a moment of context, because it isn't really about restricting grief so much as protecting it. A boat launch functioning as an active tactical operations center during a search, with law enforcement, volunteer crews, and aircraft coordination all happening simultaneously, is also, unfortunately, exactly the kind of scene that can attract onlookers, media crews, and in some documented cases nationally, even opportunistic scammers posing as concerned community members, especially once word of a recovered body starts to spread locally before any official confirmation. Controlling who has physical access to a grieving family in that specific window, family, close friends, essential personnel, and no one else, isn't bureaucratic overreach. It's a deliberate, practiced piece of crisis management, designed to give a family the one thing they genuinely need in that exact moment. Space to fall apart without an audience of strangers watching them do it. And then the sheriff himself, not a deputy, the sheriff walked over to deliver what Josh Gill carefully called a non-formal notification. A body had been found, here is where it will be taken, here is what happens next. Because at that point in the process nobody, not the sheriff, not the coroner, not Josh Gill, was in any position to say with certainty whose body it was. The fact that it was the sheriff himself who made that trip across the parking lot, rather than delegating it to a deputy, is itself a meaningful, if easy to overlook, detail. Many law enforcement agencies nationally have moved, over the past couple of decades, toward formalizing exactly this kind of personal senior-level involvement in death notifications, sometimes through dedicated victim advocate or family liaison positions specifically trained in how to deliver catastrophic news with as much care as the moment allows. Research on death notification, much of it originating from studies of military casualty notification officers, has found consistently that the manner of a notification, who delivers it, how much time they take, whether they treat the family with visible respect rather than clinical detachment, has a measurable, lasting effect on how that family processes the loss for years afterward, entirely independent of the facts being delivered. A sheriff choosing to make that walk himself, and a search and rescue incident commander describing him afterward unprompted as extremely compassionate, extremely professional, is a small data point suggesting this specific department understood exactly how much that first in-person moment mattered, and treated it accordingly. Behind that conversation, a separate, entirely procedural process was already underway, one that has nothing to do with comforting a family and everything to do with preserving the eventual integrity of any case built from this evidence, chain of custody. From the moment a body is recovered at a scene, every single transfer of that body, and of any evidence recovered alongside it, from the recovery site to a transport vehicle, from that vehicle to the coroner's facility, from initial examination to storage pending autopsy, has to be documented, time-stamped, and signed off on by whoever has physical custody at each step. This isn't bureaucratic box-checking. If this case ever proceeds toward a criminal trial, a defense attorney's very first line of challenge to any physical evidence is almost always chain of custody. Any gap, any undocumented handoff, any period where custody can't be clearly accounted for, becomes an opening to argue the evidence itself can't be trusted. That's part of why Josh Gill's account emphasizes more than once exactly who was present at each step, who the sheriff was, whether it was a deputy or the sheriff himself, precisely because those details, mundane as they sound in the retelling, are the same details a chain of custody record is built from, and the same details that will matter enormously if this case ever reaches a courtroom. This distinction matters more than it might seem to on the surface, and it's worth understanding in general terms, because it comes up constantly in cases like this one. Law enforcement agencies are trained, almost universally, not to confirm an identity to a family based on circumstance alone. A missing person's age, general build, or last known location matching a body's discovery. The reason isn't bureaucratic coldness. It's that false identifications, even well-intentioned ones delivered compassionately, cause a specific and severe secondary trauma. Families have, in documented cases across the country, been told informally that a body matches their loved one, begun the grieving process, made funeral arrangements, and then had that identification reversed days later when forensic confirmation came back different. Because of that risk, official protocol in nearly every jurisdiction requires waiting for a scientific identification method before anything is said to a family as fact, no matter how obvious the circumstances appear to be to everyone standing in that parking lot. That's the tightrope the sheriff was walking that morning. Compassionate enough to explain what he could, honest enough not to promise what he couldn't yet confirm. Christine, according to Josh Gill, asked him to come with the family to the coroner's office. He said he was extremely honored to be asked, and the sheriff's department escorted them there. I want you to picture that office the way Josh Gill described it, because it is not what you expect from film and television. He said walking in it didn't feel like a coroner's office at all. It felt like a business office. A conference room. No stark sterile hallway, no cold fluorescent theater of death. A table, chairs, family members and friends filling every seat, himself among them, and a coroner who walked in within 10 or 15 seconds of everyone being seated. He described the man as polite, professional, well-spoken and soft-spoken. Someone who clearly understood exactly what kind of room he was walking into and calibrated his voice and his pace accordingly. That physical detail, an ordinary conference room instead of a sterile institutional set piece, is a deliberate design choice a lot of modern medical examiner and coroner offices have moved toward over the past couple of decades. And it's worth understanding why, because it isn't simply a cost-saving measure. Environmental and hospital design researchers who study how physical spaces affect people receiving traumatic news have found, repeatedly, that sterile clinical environments, hard fluorescent lighting, exposed institutional furniture, the visual and olfactory cues of a medical facility, measurably heighten a person's stress response, even when the actual news being delivered is identical to what it would be in a softer room. A warmer, more ordinary setting, soft furniture, table and chairs instead of an exam table, doesn't change the facts a family is about to hear, but it changes the body's baseline arousal level walking into that conversation, which in turn affects how much of what's said the family can actually absorb and retain in the moment, rather than simply enduring in a fog of adrenaline. Offices that have made this shift deliberately, moving away from the cold, procedural spaces true crime television has trained audiences to expect, report it as one of the more effective, low-cost improvements available to them for reducing the compounding secondary trauma of the notification process itself. The coroner told them, based on initial appearance, that he believed the body was Nolan. He wanted a DNA sample from the family, he said, for further confirmation and for record-keeping. And when Christine asked about the condition of the body, he told her there were no immediate signs of foul play. Sit with that phrase for a second because it became, in the weeks that followed, one of the most contested 6 words in the entire case. No immediate signs of foul play. To a family desperate for any shred of information, that phrase can sound almost like relief. No stabbing, no shooting, no obvious violence. But as our panel would go on to discuss at length, no immediate signs of foul play is a phrase describing a cursory visual examination, not a completed autopsy. It does not mean an examiner has ruled out subcutaneous injury, internal trauma, or markings hidden beneath skin that has already begun the natural process of decomposition. It specifically does not address what would later become one of the most debated physical details in the entire case. A deep red marking, subcutaneous, discovered later at the back of Nolan's head, near the occipital region, a marking 2 separate medical examiners would eventually look at and still be unable to definitively explain. Was it lividity, the pooling of blood that happens naturally after death when a body settles into a fixed position? Was it early cellular decomposition, which can produce discoloration that looks dramatic and clinically means very little? Or was it evidence of blunt force trauma that a first cursory look, in a business office conference room, simply wasn't positioned to catch? Nobody in that room on that first day had an answer. Nobody claimed to. There's a real documented reason a phrase like no immediate signs of foul play gets used so often at this early stage of a case, and it isn't evasiveness. Medical examiners and coroners are trained, as a matter of professional discipline, to avoid stating anything as a conclusion before the actual data supports it, because premature statements, even well-meaning ones offered to comfort a family, have real downstream consequences. They can shape how law enforcement prioritizes a scene. They can be quoted back in a courtroom years later as an official finding rather than a preliminary impression. And if they turn out to be wrong, they can badly damage a family's trust in the entire process at exactly the moment that trust matters most. No immediate signs is, in that light, a genuinely honest phrase, maybe the only fully honest phrase available at that stage. It says exactly what was and wasn't observed in that specific room at that specific moment, without pretending to a certainty that a 15-second walkthrough of a body simply cannot provide. The tragedy of it, for a family, is that the phrase is honest and still capable of being badly misheard, because grief-stricken listeners understandably want it to mean more than it's actually saying. This is the moment to bring in some general, non-case-specific context about how forensic identification actually works, because it explains something that confused a lot of people who followed this case closely. Why, if Nolan's mother was sitting 15 feet away in that conference room, the identification of her own son ultimately came down to dental records rather than a visual confirmation from the people who loved him most. In any death investigation, the gold standard order of operations for identifying a body runs roughly like this. First, if at all possible, investigators attempt visual identification. A family member or friend looking at the deceased and confirming who they are. It's the fastest method and, when a body is well preserved, often the most immediately conclusive. But visual identification depends entirely on the body still looking recognizably like the person it was in life, and a body that has been exposed to heat, sun, insects, or water for even a day or two can change enough that a visual identification becomes unreliable or simply impossible, and in some cases investigators will deliberately avoid putting a grieving family through the attempt at all, precisely because a failed or uncertain visual identification can compound trauma rather than resolve it. If visual identification isn't viable, the next fastest scientific method is fingerprinting, provided the person has prints on file somewhere. A driver's license application, a prior arrest, a military or government background check, and provided the body's hands are still in a condition where a usable print can be lifted. Prolonged water exposure changes the skin on the hands and feet in a very specific, very well-documented way. Forensic literature calls it washerwoman's skin, the same wrinkling effect you get from sitting in a bathtub too long, except in a body that's been submerged or partially submerged for an extended period. That effect can progress to the point where the outer layer of skin becomes fragile, macerated, or even begins to separate entirely, making a clean, usable fingerprint difficult or outright impossible to obtain. Forensic references generally describe this process unfolding in recognizable stages tied to time submerged and water temperature. Light wrinkling of the palms and soles within the first several hours, progressing to more pronounced, whitened wrinkling resembling a much longer bath soak within roughly a day, and in warmer water especially, advancing further within 2 to 3 days to a stage where the outer skin layer can begin to loosen enough that it separates from the underlying tissue. Nearly intact, a phenomenon forensic examiners sometimes refer to informally as gloving, because the loosened skin can occasionally be removed in one piece almost like peeling off a glove, and in some cases can even be used by a trained examiner as a fingerprinting surface in its own right when the underlying hand itself is too damaged. Where exactly a given body falls along that timeline depends heavily on water temperature, salinity, and how much of the body was actually submerged versus exposed to open air, which circles back to the same core forensic challenge this case presents. A body recovered half in sand and half in water sits at an unusually complicated intersection of several different environmental timelines at once. When neither visual identification nor fingerprinting is viable, the standard next step is dental records, comparing the dental structure of the deceased against existing dental records from when the person was alive. Teeth are remarkably resistant to the early stages of decomposition and environmental exposure compared to soft tissue, which is exactly why forensic dentistry, sometimes called forensic odontology, has been a cornerstone of body identification for well over a century, used in everything from individual death investigations to mass casualty disaster identification. And only after those three methods are exhausted, or when a case specifically requires the highest possible evidentiary certainty, for example, a case that investigators believe may eventually go to trial as a homicide, does the process typically move to DNA analysis, which is both the most conclusive method available and by a wide margin the slowest and most expensive, sometimes taking weeks for lab results to come back depending on jurisdiction and lab backlog. DNA identification generally works by comparing a genetic profile taken from the deceased against either a known reference sample, a cheek swab or blood sample from a parent, sibling, or child, since close biological relatives share predictable, measurable portions of genetic material, or against an existing profile already logged in a national system. In the United States, that system is called CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, maintained by the FBI, originally built to help law enforcement match crime scene evidence against convicted offenders, but which also plays a growing role in victim identification generally. A direct family reference comparison of the kind discussed with Christine and her husband at the coroner's office is typically the faster of the two DNA pathways, since it doesn't require waiting on a national database search, but it still requires laboratory processing time that measures in weeks, not hours, which is exactly why dental records, when available and viable, are so often used as the faster interim confirmation while DNA testing runs in parallel as an additional final layer of certainty. It was Crime Story's investigative reporter Dave Mack who pinned this fact down on air, plainly and without hedging, in one short exchange that cut through a lot of the surrounding uncertainty. Asked directly, wasn't Nolan identified through dental records, the answer that came back was a simple, unqualified yes. He was identified with dental records. No equivocation, no we believe, just a flat, confirmed fact, delivered the way a reporter delivers something he has independently verified rather than something he's merely repeating secondhand. In Nolan Wells's case, according to that same Crime Stories investigative reporting, the identification was ultimately confirmed through dental records. That single fact, dental records, not fingerprints, not an immediate visual identification by the people who knew him best, tells you something important about the condition Nolan's body was in when it was recovered, without anyone having to say it directly. It tells you visual identification wasn't considered reliable enough to stand on its own. It tells you fingerprinting likely wasn't viable either, whether because of decomposition, water exposure, or both. And it raises, honestly and directly, the exact question a forensic expert would go on to raise on this broadcast. If the body was too changed for a confident visual identification or a workable fingerprint, how confident can anyone be that a cursory first look was enough to definitively rule out visible signs of trauma on that same body? This is where the case takes its strangest turn, and it's the turn that a bloodstain pattern analyst and death investigator, brought on to give expert forensic context, focused on almost immediately: the location where Nolan Wells's body was actually found. According to Josh Gill's own account, and confirmed by aerial photographs taken during the search, Nolan's body was found on Horn Island in a position that struck more than one experienced investigator as deeply unusual. Not floating, not fully submerged. Positioned at the edge of the beach, roughly 3 to 4 feet from the water's edge on wet sand, in a spot where an ordinary person wading in would barely get their ankles damp. Drowning is, in general, one of the more statistically common ways a young adult dies unexpectedly around open water, particularly on a holiday weekend built specifically around boating, swimming, and alcohol, a combination public health researchers consistently flag as the leading contributing factor in unintentional drowning deaths among people in their late teens and 20s. National public health data tracked over recent years consistently shows drowning deaths spiking around exactly this kind of occasion: a warm weather holiday, open water, large gatherings, alcohol involved for at least some portion of the group, which is precisely why a case like Nolan's, on its surface, fits an extremely common and usually tragic but straightforward pattern. That statistical ordinariness is exactly what makes the unusual physical details in this specific case: the body's position on dry sand rather than in the water, the unexplained marking, the reliance on dental records for identification, stand out as meaningfully atypical rather than simply another data point in an unfortunately common category. It's also worth understanding just how much investigative weight a set of aerial photographs like the ones referenced throughout this broadcast can actually carry. Modern search and rescue operations, particularly those involving fixed-wing aircraft and drones, generate high-resolution imagery that can be examined afterward with a level of detail impossible to gather from the ground in real time, measuring the actual distance between a recovery site and the waterline, cross-referencing driftwood and debris patterns against known wind and wave data from that day, and establishing an objective, time-stamped visual record of a scene well before an official evidence team physically walked it. This is part of why Josh Gill, and separately, the forensic experts weighing in on this case, kept returning to specific photographs rather than general recollection. A photograph taken from the air at a known time is a piece of physical evidence in its own right, one that can be measured, re-examined, and cross-checked by multiple experts independently, long after the scene itself has changed with the next tide. A career death investigator named Jeff Gentry, a forensic certified bloodstain pattern analyst, crime scene analyst, and author of a book on forensic science, someone who has responded to bodies recovered from canals, rivers, and lakes for years, said on this broadcast that in his professional experience, that position simply doesn't match the pattern he's used to seeing. Before he answered a single question about the case itself, he walked through, in plain terms, exactly how forensic identification is supposed to work in order, a sequence worth understanding fully because it's the actual backbone of why this case turned out the way it did. He explained that investigators always try visual identification first, using family or friends or an ID document as a reference point, because it's fastest. If that isn't viable, the next step is fingerprints, the easiest and quickest scientific method, provided the person has prints on file and the hands themselves are in a condition where a usable print can still be lifted. If a body has been deceased for a day or more before it's found, he explained, both of those first two options can simply disappear as possibilities, which pushes the process to alternate methods: dental records, compared against records from when the person was alive, or, as an even more time-consuming and expensive last resort, DNA. The method of choice specifically when a case is expected to eventually go to trial as a homicide, because of how precisely it can be expressed in percentages of certainty. Jeff Gentry can be found, for anyone who wants to read more of his forensic writing on cases like this one, at evidencyoverassumption.com. His stated expectation, based on the physics of how drowning victims are typically recovered, is that a body tends to be found at or very near the location where the person actually went under, unless there's a documented strong current or significant wave action pushing it elsewhere. He also raised a second point that's easy to miss if you're not thinking about it from an investigator's chair. Most drowning victims, particularly in cooler or moderately temperature-controlled water, are relatively well preserved for the first day or two after submersion, because water slows certain stages of decomposition compared to open-air exposure in summer heat. A body recovered quickly from open water, in his professional experience, is often less decomposed, not more, than one exposed to direct summer sun and insects on dry land for the same amount of time. That's part of why he found it so surprising that Nolan's body appeared to be in a state that ultimately required dental records rather than a straightforward visual identification. A professional reaction worth taking seriously precisely because it came from someone who has stood at the edge of enough recovery scenes, in enough different conditions, to know what's ordinary and what genuinely isn't. Josh Gill, for his part, offered a direct and specific counter-explanation, rooted in his years of hands-on water search and rescue experience in that exact geography. He pointed to aerial photographs from the search showing driftwood scattered well up onto the beach, evidence, in his reading, of real wave action reaching that far inland. He described the combined effect of wind, wave, tide, and current in that particular stretch of water using a phrase familiar to people who spend their working lives on boats. A washing machine, a high-tide, high-current area where anything that goes into the water, debris, driftwood, unfortunately even a body, can be pushed and pulled up onto shore the same way shells and sea glass and message bottles wash up on any beach in the world. In one of the aerial photographs, he said, you can see a wave cresting almost directly over where the body was located, which in his reading is direct visual evidence that wave action absolutely was reaching that spot, contrary to any assumption that the water there was calm and still. Barrier islands like Horn Island, sitting exposed between open Gulf water and a protected sound behind them, are exactly the kind of terrain where rip currents and unpredictable longshore drift are common enough that public safety agencies issue regular advisories about them, particularly around holiday weekends when swimmer volume spikes. A rip current, in general terms, is a narrow, fast-moving channel of water flowing away from shore, formed where waves push water inland faster than it can drain back out evenly, forcing it to funnel back out through a specific gap, often one that's invisible from the surface to anyone standing on the beach. Rip currents are responsible for a significant share of surf-related rescues and drowning deaths nationally every year, precisely because they can pull a strong, capable swimmer out into deeper water quickly, exhausting them before they understand what's happening, all without the water ever looking obviously dangerous from the shoreline. Whether a rip current or a comparable localized current played any role in what happened to Nolan on Horn Island is exactly the kind of specific, resolvable question a formal hydrological review of that day's conditions, not general reasoning from photographs after the fact, would actually be positioned to answer. It's a genuinely humbling fact about open water generally. It can look completely calm from the shore and still be actively, silently dangerous just a few feet further out. Two experienced people, looking at the same set of facts, reaching two different working theories, one grounded in general statistical patterns of where drowning victims are typically recovered, the other grounded in specific local hands-on knowledge of exactly how wind and tide behave on that particular island on that particular kind of day. Neither of them is wrong to hold their view. That tension between statistical pattern and specific local knowledge is precisely the kind of open question that a real professional water currents and tides expert would need to resolve with actual data from that day, recorded tide charts, wind speed and direction, wave height, before anyone can say with confidence which explanation actually accounts for where Nolan Wells ended up. This is exactly the kind of question the United States Coast Guard has spent decades building specialized software to answer, a system called SARIPS, the Search and Rescue Optimal Planning System, which models how wind, current, and an object's own physical drift characteristics interact over time to predict where a person or piece of debris would most likely end up after entering the water at a known or estimated location. It's the same underlying science Josh Gill was reasoning through informally, from memory and experience, when he pointed to driftwood on the beach and wave action in the photographs, real oceanographic drift modeling, just performed by a trained human eye reading physical evidence rather than a computer running historical wind and current data. A formal drift analysis, run with the actual recorded conditions from that specific 4th of July, would be able to say with far more precision than either informal theory offered on this broadcast whether Nolan's recovery location is consistent with typical drift patterns for that day, or whether it represents a genuine outlier worth investigating further, exactly the kind of concrete, resolvable question this case still has sitting in front of it, waiting on someone with the authority and the resources to actually run it. The data that kind of analysis would actually run on already exists, and has existed the whole time, sitting quietly in a federal database most people never think about. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration maintains a network of tide gauge stations across the Mississippi Sound and the broader Gulf Coast, continuously logging water level, and in many locations wind speed and direction, in near real time, archived permanently and available to the public. That means the actual recorded tide height, current direction, and wind conditions for the specific hours in question on that 4th of July are not lost to memory or guesswork at all. They are sitting time-stamped and precise, in a public federal archive waiting for exactly the kind of formal drift reconstruction this case still needs. This is, in a very real sense, the single most concrete, apolitical, immediately available next step available to resolve the wave and current disagreement aired on this broadcast. Pull the actual recorded data for that day and run it. No new search required. No new equipment. Just the will to actually look. It's worth taking a breath here and talking honestly about something that has nothing to do with tide charts or dental records. What it's like to be the mother in that room while two grown men who love and support you argue, gently, respectfully, but unmistakably, about whether your son's body ended up on a beach through ordinary wave action, or through something that needs to be investigated further. If you've ever sat in a hospital family lounge while doctors debated a loved one's prognosis in careful hedged language just outside your hearing, you already have some sense of what that feels like, the specific, awful helplessness of being the person the conversation is actually about while feeling like a spectator to it. Grief counselors who specialize in ambiguous or unresolved loss where the how and why remain genuinely unsettled, describe this as one of the cruelest structural features of a case like this one. Ordinary grief, however devastating, at least eventually comes with an accepted narrative. This is what happened, this is why, and grief slowly reorganizes itself around that narrative over months and years. Ambiguous loss denies a family even that. Every new detail, every expert opinion, every dental record and coroner's report reopens the central question instead of closing it, which is part of why families in cases like this one often describe grief not as a single wave they eventually ride out, but as a door that keeps reopening every time new information arrives. The scholar most credited with formally naming this concept, a family therapist who spent decades studying the families of missing soldiers and missing persons, drew a specific distinction that applies directly here. There are two categories of ambiguous loss, one where a person is physically absent but the family isn't certain whether they're alive or dead, and a second, less discussed category where a person is physically present, even after death, even in the form of a recovered body, but the psychological story of what happened to them remains genuinely unresolved. Christine's situation sits closer to that second category. She has her son's body. She has a name, a face, a burial. What she doesn't have in any complete sense is the story, the how, and the exact why of the last hours of his life. Families navigating this second kind of ambiguous loss frequently report a specific disorienting symptom, an inability to fully complete what grief researchers call the meaning-making process, the psychological work of integrating a loss into a coherent life narrative, because meaning-making generally requires a stable set of facts to make meaning out of, and a case that keeps generating new forensic questions never quite stops moving long enough for that integration to finish. The ground underneath her keeps shifting. Months after the day it should have finally gone still. There's a related, more hopeful line of psychological research worth sitting with here too, built around what's formally called hope theory, which describes hope not as a vague, passive feeling but as a specific, measurable cognitive structure built from two components: a clear goal and a believed pathway toward reaching it. Applied to a family like Christine's, that framework helps explain something that might otherwise look contradictory: how a mother can simultaneously grieve completely and still actively push for more answers, without those two things canceling each other out. Her goal is not bringing her son back. She has already, by every account, accepted that loss. Her goal is a complete, truthful account of what happened to him, and every step she's taken since, the independent pathologist, the attorney, the continued public attention, represents a believed pathway toward that specific, narrower goal. Psychologists who study hope in exactly this kind of prolonged, ambiguous situation find that this narrower, achievable form of hope, hope for truth rather than hope for reversal, tends to be considerably more sustainable over the long haul than hope aimed at something that can never actually happen, which may be part of why Christine, by Josh Gill's account, has been able to keep functioning, keep advocating, keep showing up, months into a process that shows no sign of resolving quickly. Hope, in that narrower, more disciplined sense, is not naivety. It's a strategy, and by every account available to us tonight, she's holding on to it with both hands. If you're watching this and you've ever had a moment where you got a phone call that changed everything, where the ordinary texture of a Tuesday or a holiday weekend just stopped and something else took over your whole body, you already understand something Christine understood the second that phone rang. Some information doesn't need confirmation to become true. Confirmation is for the record. It's for the case file, for the courtroom, for the paperwork the state requires before it will officially agree with what a mother's body already knew standing in a parking lot. That gap between what you know in your bones and what the system requires you to prove before it will act is where a lot of this case's pain actually lives. Think for a moment about the last time you couldn't reach someone you loved for a few hours longer than felt normal. Maybe it was a teenager who didn't answer a text before curfew. Maybe it was a parent who usually calls after work and on one particular evening just didn't. Most of the time, for almost everyone who has ever felt that specific flavor of dread, the story ends in something completely ordinary: a dead phone battery, bad service, someone who simply lost track of time having a good night with friends. That's the outcome the overwhelming majority of us get to have every single time for our entire lives, without ever having to think about it as a mercy. Christine got the other outcome, the one in thousands version. The version that turns a mother's ordinary evening vigilance into the worst chapter of her life. Nothing about who she is as a parent, how carefully she raised her son, or how much she loved him made her more or less likely to end up living through this. That randomness, the fact that a devoted, present, loving mother can still end up standing in that coroner's conference room, is exactly why this story deserves to be told with this much care, rather than treated as a cautionary tale about anything Christine or Nolan did differently from any other family. It could have been anyone's phone that rang that morning. We're going to keep going because there is a lot more Josh Gill described about that day, and about the questions this case has raised since. But before we do, if this story is holding your attention the way it's holding ours, do one simple thing right now. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Cases like this one don't resolve in a single episode. New details surface in the middle of an ongoing investigation, sometimes weeks or months apart, and subscribing is the only way you'll actually see the next update the moment we publish it, instead of hoping the algorithm happens to show it to you. It costs nothing, it takes 5 seconds, and it's genuinely the only way to make sure you don't miss where this goes next. Back in that conference room, after the coroner explained what he could, the family asked what happens next. Josh Gill said he specifically asked the coroner to walk them through the process, where Nolan's body would go, what would happen from there. And the coroner explained that it would be sent on for further autopsy at what Josh Gill believed was a crime lab. He was careful, describing this part of the conversation, to say he was paraphrasing, that this was weeks removed from the actual meeting and secondhand in the sense that he wasn't a medical professional relaying medical terminology precisely. But the substance of it was clear enough to everyone in that room. Nolan wasn't simply being released to a funeral home. He was being sent onward for further, more detailed examination. A full forensic autopsy in a case like this one routinely includes a standard toxicology panel, testing blood, and sometimes other tissue, for the presence of alcohol and a broad range of common drugs, both illicit and prescription. This isn't a targeted accusation against the deceased. It's a completely routine, standard component of any unwitnessed death investigation, run essentially every time, because it answers a foundational question that shapes everything else about how a case gets interpreted. Was impairment a factor at all in whatever happened? Given that Nolan was, by every account, at a 4th of July gathering on a boating and party destination, a setting where alcohol consumption is common and broadly expected, a toxicology finding either way would carry real weight for how investigators, and eventually the public, understand what happened in his final hours, not as a moral judgment on him, but as one more genuinely useful data point, alongside the water evidence, the insect evidence, and the internal examination findings in reconstructing an otherwise unwitnessed sequence of events. As of this reporting, those toxicology results, like the completed autopsy itself, have not been made fully public. It's worth being direct about a specific trap true crime coverage falls into constantly, one we want to name explicitly rather than simply avoid and hope you notice. The moment alcohol or a party setting enters a case like this one, public conversation has a well-documented tendency to slide, almost automatically, toward quietly blaming the victim for their own death, treating ordinary legal, widely practiced behavior, drinking at a holiday gathering with friends, as though it somehow forfeits a person's claim to a full rigorous investigation into how they died. Doesn't. Millions of people spend a 4th of July exactly the way Nolan reportedly did, at a gathering with friends on the water with some drinking involved, and return home safely the next day. Whatever role, if any, alcohol played in Nolan's final hours, it does not change what's owed to him and to his family. A complete, honest, unhurried investigation into exactly what happened, with the same rigor a case would receive if the setting had been a quiet backyard barbecue instead of an island party. Naming this trap explicitly matters, because it's precisely the kind of unconscious framing that can quietly lower the pressure and scrutiny a case receives, exactly the outcome nobody following this story wants. Nolan Wells deserves the same rigorous investigation any other missing young man would get, full stop, no asterisk attached. Before we go further into the identification and what came after, it's worth explaining in general terms why a case like this one, a young person found deceased with no witness cause of death, automatically escalates to a full forensic autopsy rather than a simple death certificate, because it's a piece of process almost nobody understands until they're forced to live through it. In the United States, medical examiner and coroner systems are generally required, either by state statute or by internal office policy, to conduct a full forensic autopsy anytime a death is sudden, unexpected, unwitnessed, or occurs under circumstances that aren't immediately and unambiguously natural. A young person recovered from a body of water under unclear circumstances checks essentially every one of those boxes simultaneously. That doesn't mean investigators suspect homicide specifically. Plenty of full forensic autopsies are ultimately ruled accidental or natural. It means the system is designed deliberately to default toward more scrutiny rather than less whenever a death doesn't come with an obvious, witnessed, natural explanation, precisely because it is far easier to rule something out early with a thorough examination than to try to prove something years later once evidence has degraded or been lost. It's worth knowing briefly where this whole office even comes from, because the word coroner itself is centuries old and carries a much stranger history than most people ever stop to consider. The office traces back to medieval England, to a role literally called the crowner, an official whose original job wasn't examining bodies for cause of death at all, but protecting the crown's financial interest, investigating sudden deaths partly to make sure the king got his cut of any resulting fines or forfeited property. Over hundreds of years, that role slowly transformed, county by county, into something closer to what we'd recognize today. An official tasked with determining on behalf of the public rather than the treasury, how and why someone died. When that system crossed the Atlantic with English colonists, it took root unevenly across the states, which is exactly why today some counties still use an elected coroner, sometimes with no medical background required at all, while others use an appointed, board-certified forensic pathologist working as a medical examiner, two different systems existing side by side across the country, doing conceptually the same job with very different levels of formal medical training behind the answer. A grieving family ultimately receives. Whichever version a family ends up dealing with in their own county is mostly an accident of geography, not a reflection of how seriously their loved one's death is being taken. Whichever office handles a given case, every death certificate issued in the United States ultimately gets assigned one of 5 standardized manner of death classifications: natural, accident, suicide, homicide, or undetermined. That last category, undetermined, exists specifically for cases exactly like this one, where the available evidence doesn't clearly support any of the other 4, and it is not a placeholder that gets discarded once a case moves further along. It can remain a case's official, permanent classification indefinitely if the evidence never resolves clearly enough to justify a more specific finding. An undetermined classification is not a failure of the system. It's the system being honest about a genuine evidentiary limit, and it's worth understanding going into whatever comes next in this case, that undetermined is a real legitimate final answer some families have to learn to live with every bit as much as the other 4. Josh Gill, in describing the coroner's demeanor throughout that meeting, returned more than once to a specific detail. He said he personally reiterated to Christine and to Nolan's father, a man named Mr. Elmore, that Nolan would be treated with the utmost dignity and respect throughout the entire process. He said explicitly that this is something families always need to hear, that it matters enormously to parents in this position to know that the system handling their child's body isn't simply processing a case number, that somebody along the way is speaking the words out loud that acknowledge this is still someone's son. At one point, describing the family's reaction as the coroner explained what would happen next, Josh Gill described himself, without any prompting, as an empath, and said plainly that even as someone who spends his working life around exactly this kind of loss, he still can't fully imagine what it feels like to be told your son is no longer here with you, no matter what the eventual outcome turns out to be. It's a small, almost throwaway line in a much longer account, but it's worth not skipping past, because it says something honest about the limits of even the most experienced, well-intentioned support. There is a real ceiling to how close another person, however compassionate, however present, can actually get to standing inside a parent's specific grief. Josh Gill clearly knew that ceiling existed, and said so plainly, rather than pretending his empathy could fully close that distance. That kind of honesty from someone in his position is itself a form of respect for what Christine was actually going through. He described Christine's reaction to hearing the coroner's initial belief that the body was Nolan as quiet, not explosive, not a scene of denial and table-pounding refusal. He said, and this stuck with him enough that he brought it up unprompted, that in his read of the room, she had already internally accepted what she was being told, and he offered a specific reason he believed that, her professional background. Christine, he said, works as a nurse practitioner, someone with a medical background of her own, someone who understood the language and the process being described to her in a way a layperson might not, and who, in his read, extended the coroner a kind of professional courtesy and trust because she recognized, on some level, a fellow medical professional speaking to her honestly rather than delivering a scripted, hedged non-answer. There's a specific double-edged difficulty that comes with being a medical professional receiving this kind of news about your own child, one that colleagues who work in healthcare describe consistently. A layperson can, at least for a little while, hold on to some vague uncertainty about medical terminology, some small buffer of not fully understanding that a doctor or nurse simply doesn't have available to them. Christine, hearing terms like decomposition, subcutaneous, and manner of death, wasn't hearing them as unfamiliar clinical language to be decoded later. She understood in real time exactly what each phrase meant and exactly what it implied, with none of the softening distance an unfamiliar term can sometimes provide a family member outside the medical field. That expertise almost certainly helped her navigate the coroner's office with the clarity Josh Gill described. It may also have meant she absorbed the full weight of what was being said faster and more completely than most people in that room ever could. That detail matters more than it might seem to on first listen, because it complicates a natural assumption a lot of viewers make about grieving parents in cases like this. The assumption that a parent who accepts a coroner's initial read is somehow less committed to finding the truth, or less suspicious of the circumstances, than a parent who resists it. Most people carry around a simplified, popular version of the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, treating it as a fixed sequence a person moves through in order, arriving at acceptance only once the earlier stages have been fully worked through. The psychiatrist who originally developed that framework was actually describing something considerably messier, and later in her career explicitly pushed back against the rigid, linear reading it's since been popularly flattened into. Those 5 experiences in the original research aren't sequential steps on a checklist, they're recurring emotional states a grieving person can move through in any order, revisit repeatedly, or experience simultaneously, sometimes within the same hour. Christine displaying what looked like acceptance within the very first day is not evidence she skipped denial, anger, or bargaining. It's far more likely evidence that all of those states were present at once, layered on top of each other, exactly the way modern grief research actually describes real human grieving, rather than the tidy sequential version most people carry around from pop psychology. What Josh Gill described was something more layered than that. Accepting that the body in that building was almost certainly your son is not the same thing as accepting a final, complete explanation for how he ended up there, or accepting that the investigation is finished. Christine, by every account given on this broadcast, did both things simultaneously. She accepted, quickly and with what appeared to be real clarity, the fact of her son's death, while never accepting that the full story behind it had actually been told. She retained an attorney relatively quickly afterward. She sought out, in the following days, a second independent forensic pathologist, a specific and deliberate step that families only take when they believe the first, official examination may not be the last word on what happened. It's worth understanding, in general terms, what actually goes into hiring an independent forensic pathologist, because it's a far more complicated and far more limited undertaking than it might sound like from the outside. A private, family-retained pathologist does not simply repeat the original autopsy from scratch. In most cases, the original medical examiner's office retains custody of tissue samples, photographs, toxicology results, and the body itself for a period of time, and an independent pathologist's review often has to work within and around whatever has already been done, reviewing the original autopsy report and photographs in detail, requesting access to retained tissue samples for independent testing, and where the body hasn't yet been released for burial or has been preserved appropriately, sometimes conducting a second independent physical examination. If a body has already been embalmed or buried, a second full physical autopsy becomes significantly more limited, sometimes requiring exhumation, a legally and emotionally weighty step that isn't undertaken lightly by any family. Families who pursue this route are usually doing so for one of two closely related reasons: genuine disagreement or discomfort with a specific finding in the original report, or simply the desire for a second, truly independent set of eyes, unaffiliated with the original agency, reviewing the same evidence before the family accepts it as final. Retaining independent counsel alongside an independent pathologist, as Christine did, is common practice specifically because an attorney can formally request records and samples on a family's behalf through legal channels that move faster, and with more institutional weight, than an informal request from a grieving parent alone. It's also worth understanding, in general terms, that a family retaining an attorney in a case like this one is very often thinking about two entirely separate legal tracks running in parallel, not just one. The first is the criminal track, whatever a district attorney's office and eventually a grand jury decide to do with the evidence, a process the family has no direct control over and can only push, pressure, and wait on. The second is a civil track, entirely separate from any criminal proceeding, where a family can, if the facts support it, pursue a wrongful death claim against a specific individual or entity they believe bears responsibility, a lawsuit that operates under a lower evidentiary standard than a criminal case and that a family actually controls and directs themselves, rather than depending on a prosecutor's discretion. It's a common and often overlooked fact that a civil wrongful death case can proceed, and in some well-known instances nationally has succeeded, even after a criminal case failed to produce charges or a conviction, because the two systems ask different questions under different standards of proof. An attorney representing a family this early in a case is very often laying groundwork for both tracks simultaneously, regardless of which one, if either, ultimately becomes necessary. That distinction between accepting a loss and accepting an explanation for it deserves a moment of general context, because it comes up in nearly every prominent unresolved manner of death case that reaches national attention. Families in this position are frequently characterized, sometimes unfairly, as either fully cooperative and trusting of the process, or as combative and distrustful of it, as though those are the only two postures available. In reality, forensic psychologists who study families navigating ambiguous death investigations describe a much more common third posture: simultaneous trust and skepticism, running on parallel tracks, often within the exact same conversation. A parent can genuinely believe an official examiner is competent, well-intentioned, and telling the truth as far as they currently know it, while also genuinely believing that the process isn't finished, that more information could still emerge, and that seeking a second opinion isn't an accusation against the first examiner so much as basic due diligence for the single most important question left in that family's life. Both things can be true. Both things, in fact, usually are. Let's go back to Josh Gill's account of leaving the coroner's office. He said the DNA sample, a cheek swab most likely, was discussed with the family before they left, though he didn't personally witness it being collected. From there, the group moved to Nolan's family home, where people had already begun to gather. He described it as an emotional scene, not a formal one, friends and extended family arriving, filling the house, the specific, universally recognizable ritual that happens in the hours after a death becomes real inside a family's own walls. He said Todd Terrell, another figure connected to the search and rescue effort, arrived within about 30 minutes, and that the conversation at the house turned almost immediately and very practically to a GoFundMe campaign, to helping spread the word, to offering ongoing services, whatever that family might need going forward, whether it was continued search resources or simply, in his words, a shoulder to cry on. That scene, a house filling up quickly with friends, extended family and community members within hours of devastating news, is itself a well-documented and, in a strange way, protective social phenomenon. Sociologists who study community response to tragedy describe this rapid convergence of people as a form of collective grief ritual, one of the oldest and most consistent human responses to sudden loss across cultures and across history, long predating anything resembling a formal support system or grief counseling. The physical presence of other people, even when there's genuinely nothing useful for them to say, appears to do real measurable work, reducing a grieving person's sense of isolation in the first, most disorienting hours, providing simple physical tasks, answering the door, making coffee, managing incoming phone calls, that give both the family and the gathered community something concrete to do with an otherwise unbearable helplessness. A GoFundMe page in this light isn't a jarring intrusion of commerce into grief. It's simply the modern digital era version of a much older instinct, a community organizing itself quickly and instinctively to materially support a family that has just lost the ability to function normally. The same instinct that once showed up as neighbors bringing casseroles and taking turns sitting with the bereaved around the clock, refusing, plainly and simply, to let a family sit alone with something this heavy. There's something worth understanding, in general terms, about that specific moment, the transition from crisis mode search operation to sitting in a grieving family's living room discussing a fundraising page, because to an outside viewer it can look jarringly transactional, discussing money in the same conversation as raw grief. But victim advocacy professionals who work with families in the immediate aftermath of a sudden death describe this transition as, in practice, one of the most important and least glamorous parts of crisis support. Funerals cost thousands of dollars, often arriving as an unplanned expense on top of a family's existing bills, frequently within days of the death itself, at the exact moment the family has the least capacity to think clearly about logistics. Search and rescue and disaster response volunteer organizations, the ones who show up with boats and aircraft in the first hours of a search, learn quickly that practical, unglamorous support, help setting up a fundraiser, help managing the flood of well-meaning messages and casserole dishes and phone calls, is every bit as important to a grieving family's ability to function as the emotional support is, and that waiting a respectful, arbitrary amount of time before addressing it usually just means the family has to figure it out alone later with fewer people still in the room to help. Josh Gill said he and Christine stayed in contact after that day, describing what he called numerous conversations in the weeks that followed. Some of it was logistical. She asked him for a recommendation for that second independent forensic pathologist, and he provided one from someone he trusted. Some of it involved her attorney, which he described simply as her business, hers to handle as she saw fit. But the majority of it, in his description, was something much simpler and, in its own way, much more revealing: brief messages of encouragement. Keep your chin up. Know that people love and support you. He said he wanted her to know that if there were ever questions she had, things weighing on her or her family, he'd try to take some of that weight off her shoulders however he could. And then he described something that, on a broadcast built around one family's tragedy, stopped the conversation cold for a moment. Christine, in the middle of her own grief, in the middle of not knowing exactly how her own son died, took the time to ask Josh Gill about a completely different missing person he was also searching for at the time, a young man named Jadarius Minweather. She asked to be updated on that case, and explicitly told Josh Gill to pass along her prayers to Jadarius's family. It's worth being honest, here in general terms, about a well-documented pattern in exactly this kind of media coverage, one that Christine's own instinct to ask about Jadarius quietly, gently pushes back against. Media researchers who study missing persons coverage have a name for a documented disparity. Cases involving young, typically white women and, to a lesser but still measurable degree, young white men, receive dramatically more national television and digital coverage, dollar for dollar, of newsworthiness than structurally similar cases involving missing people of color, particularly missing black men. It isn't usually a matter of any one editorial decision made maliciously. It's a cumulative, industry-wide pattern, built out of thousands of individual choices about which families get booked on which programs, which cases a wire service decides are worth a national push, which local stories a producer decides will travel to a bigger audience. The practical effect, regardless of intent, is that some families searching for a missing loved one get a reward fund, a national platform, and a forensic panel, while other families going through the exact same nightmare, searching with the exact same desperation largely don't. Christine asking after Jadarius Minweather by name unprompted in the middle of her own worst weeks is a small real act that runs directly counter to that broader pattern, a reminder worth sitting with, that the people living through these tragedies often see each other's humanity far more clearly, and far more generously, than the media apparatus covering them typically does. That single detail deserves to sit on its own for a moment, without immediately being folded into a broader argument about the case, because it tells you something true and specific about who Christine is as a person, independent of anything else this case is or isn't. A grieving mother in the rawest, earliest weeks of losing her own child, with no resolution, no closure, no answers to her own hardest questions, chose to spend some of her limited emotional bandwidth on a stranger's family going through the exact same nightmare. Grief researchers have a name for this instinct: post-traumatic solidarity, sometimes called wounded healer behavior, the documented tendency of people who have survived a specific category of loss to become unusually attuned, almost involuntarily, to others facing that same category of loss, often before their own grief has even begun to resolve. It's one of the more consistently observed, almost paradoxical patterns in trauma research. People in the depths of their own crisis frequently reach outward toward someone else's, not despite their own pain but seemingly because of it, as though recognizing the same specific shape of suffering in another family makes it impossible not to reach toward them. If you've been listening to this episode and found yourself feeling something close to genuine affection for Christine, someone you've never met, whose voice you may not have even heard directly, that reaction has a name too, and it's worth understanding rather than dismissing as strange. Media researchers call it a parasocial relationship, a one-sided emotional bond a person forms with someone they observe repeatedly through media, without any actual reciprocal relationship existing. It's an entirely normal, well-documented psychological response, not a sign of anything unhealthy on its own, and it's precisely the mechanism that makes coverage like this one capable of doing real good in the world. Strangers who feel genuinely invested in a family's outcome are strangers who call in a tip, who share a case with someone who might know something, who keep a reward and a case number circulating in public conversation long after the initial news cycle would otherwise have moved on. The feeling you may have developed toward Christine over the course of this episode isn't incidental to why this coverage matters. It's a meaningful part of the actual mechanism by which public attention translates into pressure, and pressure, in a case like this one, is one of the only tools left on the table. Use it well and use it in Nolan's name. Now let's widen the lens for a moment, because a case like this one doesn't happen in a vacuum, and understanding the broader landscape it sits inside helps explain why it generated the kind of attention it did. It's worth asking honestly why so many people, disproportionately women according to published academic research on true crime audiences, choose to spend their evenings watching a broadcast like this one at all, rather than treating that pull as self-evident or a little embarrassing. One frequently cited line of psychological research on true crime consumption, built around survey data from women who reported preferring true crime over other genres, found something that runs counter to the assumption that this is simply morbid entertainment. A meaningful share of listeners reported consuming true crime content specifically as a form of learning, absorbing details about how a person ended up victimized, what warning signs existed in hindsight, what a family did right or wrong in the earliest hours of a crisis, essentially treating the material as informal survival information rather than pure spectacle. That doesn't mean every viewer's motivation is that deliberate or conscious, and it doesn't excuse content that crosses into exploitative speculation about real, identifiable people. But it does help explain why a case like this one, with an active search and rescue operation, a specific decision-making sequence at a coroner's office, and a family navigating an actual ongoing forensic process, holds an audience's attention in a different way than pure shock value would. There's something here a viewer can genuinely learn from about grief, about forensic process, about how to support a family living through exactly this kind of nightmare, that has real transferable value, well beyond this one case, whether or not you ever end up needing it for yourself. Every year, thousands of missing persons cases are opened across the United States involving young adults in their late teens and early 20s, the vast majority of which resolve within days, usually with the person turning up safe, having simply been out of contact, or having made a decision an anxious family didn't yet know about. A much smaller number resolved the way this one did, with a body recovered under circumstances ambiguous enough to require a full forensic investigation. What determines which cases break through into national true crime coverage, and which quietly close out as a single paragraph in a local paper isn't necessarily the severity of what happened. It's often a combination of factors that have nothing directly to do with the underlying facts. Whether a family is willing and able to speak publicly, whether a volunteer search and rescue organization with its own public following gets involved early, whether unusual physical details, like an unexplained subcutaneous marking two medical examiners can't agree on, exist to sustain ongoing coverage, and whether the location and timing, a 4th of July gathering on a well-known party island, generates the kind of visual, communal, easily understood setting that audiences can picture without much explanation. There's a federal database, run by the Department of Justice, called the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, built specifically because for decades there was no single searchable way to cross-reference an open missing person case in one state against an unidentified body recovered in another. It exists precisely for cases where identification is genuinely difficult, where dental records, DNA profiles, and physical descriptions have to be logged and cross-checked systematically rather than relying on a family happening to hear about a body recovered 3 counties over. The existence of a whole federal system built around exactly this problem tells you something important. The challenges investigators faced identifying Nolan Wells with confidence weren't some strange anomaly specific to this one case. They're common enough, nationally, that an entire federal infrastructure exists to help manage them, which is itself a sobering general fact about how often a body is recovered in a condition that makes a fast, easy identification genuinely impossible. That system works alongside an older one, the FBI's National Crime Information Center, which local and state law enforcement have used for decades to log missing persons reports the moment a case opens, making that information immediately visible to any other agency in the country that runs a search. In practice, this means the moment Nolan was reported missing, his information became part of a searchable, national record instantly, entirely independent of whatever a local search and rescue effort was doing on the water at the same time. The two systems serve genuinely different purposes at different stages. One flags a person as missing the moment it happens, the other exists specifically for the much harder problem this case ran into: matching a recovered body against that missing person's record when a straightforward identification isn't possible. Understanding that these systems exist and have existed for decades is worth knowing simply because it means a family living through a case like this one is never entirely dependent on local resources or local luck. There is a whole national infrastructure built and refined over generations, quietly working in the background specifically to solve exactly this kind of problem. None of that is a criticism of the coverage this case has received. It's simply an honest acknowledgement of how the true crime media ecosystem actually selects what it amplifies, because understanding that selection process helps explain something important. For every Nolan Wells whose case reaches a national audience, there are other families in other towns, living through structurally identical grief and structurally identical unanswered questions, who never get an episode like this one, never get a forensic panel, never get a national platform asking pointed questions on their behalf. That's not a flaw specific to this show or this case. It's a structural reality of true crime as a media genre, one worth sitting with honestly rather than pretending every family that deserves scrutiny and advocacy actually receives it. It's also worth acknowledging honestly that sustained public and media attention on cases like this one has, in documented instances nationally, done more than simply keep one family's story alive. It has directly contributed to real policy change. Several state-level reforms to how missing persons cases are prioritized and resourced, expanded funding for cold case units, and improved cross-jurisdictional coordination between local, state, and federal databases have followed, at least in part, from sustained public pressure generated by exactly this kind of ongoing media coverage, pressure that gave legislators and agency leadership a public mandate to fund and prioritize changes that might otherwise have stayed permanently backlogged behind less visible priorities. That's the honest, larger stake behind an episode like this one, beyond any single family's outcome. Coverage that treats a case with genuine rigor rather than pure sensationalism has, historically, been part of how systems that are otherwise slow to change actually do change. Volunteer search and rescue organizations like the United Cajun Navy occupy an interesting and, historically, somewhat contested space in disaster response and missing persons cases. Groups like this typically emerge organically out of a specific local disaster, In the Cajun Navy's case, the flooding around Louisiana and the greater Gulf Coast region, when ordinary citizens with boats realize official emergency services, however well-resourced, simply cannot reach everyone who needs help during a large-scale crisis at the same time. What often starts as an informal, ad hoc network of neighbors helping neighbors during a specific flood or hurricane frequently evolves, over years, into a standing, organized volunteer disaster response entity, one that shows up not just for hurricanes but for individual missing person searches, water recoveries, and other emergencies where additional boats, aircraft, and manpower can make a meaningful difference in how quickly someone is found. The broader pattern this fits into is one repeated across American disaster history. Official capacity, no matter how well funded, is built around average case demand, not worst case demand, and a major flood event or a wide-scale search effort routinely exceeds what any single official agency staffed and budgeted for ordinary years can absorb on its own. That gap is exactly where a citizen fleet of base boats, airboats, and personal watercraft has repeatedly proven itself decisive in recent decades of Gulf Coast disaster response, precisely because private boat owners already possess two things an overstretched agency can't manufacture quickly under pressure: physical equipment sitting in driveways across an entire region, and specific lived knowledge of local water, which channels flood first, where the current runs dangerous, which bridges become impassable, built from years of recreational and working familiarity with the exact same water they end up searching. That local expertise is precisely what Josh Gill drew on when he described reading wave action and driftwood patterns on Horn Island. It's the same skill set, applied to a single missing person instead of an entire flooded parish. It's worth knowing briefly what actually funds an operation like the one that searched for Nolan, because volunteer describes the people, not the costs. Fuel for a fixed-wing aircraft and a fleet of boats, aircraft maintenance, radios, fuel for generators running a mobile command post. None of that arrives free simply because the people operating it aren't drawing a paycheck. Organizations like this typically run almost entirely on public donations and fundraising, meaning every dollar given to a group like the United Cajun Navy, whether during an active search or in the quiet months between callouts, translates fairly directly into more aircraft hours, more fuel and more boats, and a faster, better resourced response the next time a mother makes exactly the kind of phone call Christine made that Sunday morning. These organizations occupy a genuinely complicated position relative to official law enforcement and emergency management agencies. On one hand, they bring real, tangible resources: boats, pilots, divers, drone operators, local water knowledge built over years of operating in specific rivers, lakes, and coastlines, that official agencies, stretched thin across enormous jurisdictions, frequently cannot match in the critical early hours of a search, the hours when a missing person is statistically most likely to still be found alive or, in a water search, most likely to be recoverable before conditions change. On the other hand, volunteer organizations operate outside official chain of command structures, which occasionally creates friction with law enforcement over jurisdiction, evidence handling, and public communication, and which has, in some cases nationally, generated public criticism or skepticism about volunteer groups' methods, funding, or motivations. Josh Gill alluded to this tension directly on this broadcast, noting, without elaborating extensively, that his organization had received what he called a surprising amount of hate despite being present and actively working from the very first hours of Nolan's disappearance. Whatever the merits of that criticism in any specific instance, it's worth understanding as a general structural feature of how volunteer disaster response operates in this country. It fills a real and often life-or-death gap in official resources, while simultaneously existing in a gray zone of oversight and accountability that official agencies don't have to navigate in the same way. There's a broader, recurring pattern worth naming here too. In almost every high-profile missing persons case that draws sustained online attention, the volunteers and first responders who show up earliest and stay longest frequently become targets of exactly the kind of amateur suspicion that should, logically, be reserved for actual persons of interest. Online commenters, working entirely from a search and rescue organization's public visibility rather than any actual evidence, have in numerous documented cases nationally turned their scrutiny toward the searchers themselves, questioning their motives, their funding, even in some extreme instances, insinuating involvement in the very tragedy they were working to resolve. It's a strange, almost inverted form of justice-seeking. The people doing the most visible, hands-on work to help a family are often the easiest targets for suspicion, precisely because they're visible, while whoever is actually responsible, if this does turn out to involve wrongdoing, remains comfortably out of the public eye entirely. Whatever hate Josh Gill's organization received in this case, it's worth understanding as part of that same broader, unfortunate pattern, not as evidence of anything specific to him or to the United Cajun Navy. We should talk, too, in general terms, about the specific psychological weight carried by search and rescue volunteers themselves, the Josh Gills of the world, because it's easy to watch an incident commander describe a search calmly and professionally on a broadcast and forget that these are overwhelmingly unpaid volunteers who show up to look for strangers' children again and again, often recovering the outcome nobody wants to find. Studies of volunteer search and rescue personnel have documented rates of secondary traumatic stress, sometimes called compassion fatigue, that in some cohorts approach the levels seen in professional first responders, despite these volunteers typically receiving a fraction of the institutional mental health support available to salaried police, fire, and EMS personnel. Josh Gill crying alongside Christine on that gravel lot wasn't, by that research, an unusual lapse in professional composure. It was a fully expected, well-documented feature of doing this kind of volunteer work honestly for any length of time, in a community small enough that the missing person is never simply a case file, always somebody's neighbor, somebody's classmate, somebody whose family you may well see again at the grocery store next month regardless of how the case resolves. The concept of compassion fatigue itself, first formally articulated by trauma researchers studying nurses and other caregivers decades ago, describes something specifically different from ordinary burnout. Ordinary burnout tends to build slowly, from cumulative workload and organizational stress, and can often be addressed with rest, time off, or a change in job conditions. Compassion fatigue, by contrast, comes specifically from repeated, close exposure to other people's acute suffering, and it can set in quickly, sometimes after a single searing case, even in someone who loves the work and has no complaints at all about their workload or their organization. What makes volunteer search and rescue personnel a particularly high-risk population for this specific kind of harm is the combination of repeated exposure with almost none of the institutional buffers professional first responders typically have. No mandatory post-incident counseling, no departmental peer support program, no paid leave to recover between call-outs, just one volunteer's own resilience, and whatever informal support their own family and fellow volunteers can offer standing between them and the next call that comes in. Let's return to the physical evidence itself, because that's where a lot of the public fascination, and a lot of the family's own unresolved questions genuinely lives. The marking at the back of Nolan's head, described repeatedly on this broadcast as a deep red subcutaneous marking near the occipital region, sits at the center of the debate over whether this case involves foul play or a tragic accident. It's worth walking through, in plain terms, the three leading categories of explanation that were raised, because each one carries very different implications, and understanding the difference helps you evaluate the case the way an actual forensic pathologist would, rather than the way a comment section speculates about it. The first possibility is lividity, formerly called livor mortis, the natural pooling of blood in the lowest lying parts of a body after death, caused simply by gravity acting on blood that is no longer being circulated by a beating heart. Lividity typically appears as a purplish-red discoloration and becomes fixed, meaning it no longer shifts if the body is moved, somewhere between 8 and 12 hours after death, depending heavily on ambient temperature. If Nolan's body settled face down, or with his head in a particular position, for a significant stretch of time before recovery, lividity in that exact area would be an entirely expected, natural finding with zero relationship to how he died. The second possibility is early decomposition, specifically a process sometimes called marbling, in which the breakdown of red blood cells combined with bacterial activity in the body creates a reddish-brown or purplish discoloration along vein pathways, often most visible in areas where blood vessels sit close to the surface of the skin. Decomposition proceeds faster in warm weather, faster still with any water exposure, and a body recovered even a day or two after death in July on the Mississippi Gulf Coast would be well within the window where this kind of change becomes visible and can, to an untrained eye, look dramatically abnormal even though it's a well-understood, natural postmortem process. It helps to understand decomposition as a sequence of recognized stages, rather than one continuous undifferentiated process, because forensic examiners are trained to read those stages almost the way a mechanic reads wear patterns on a part. The first stage, fresh, begins at the moment of death and involves internal cellular breakdown invisible to the naked eye. The second, bloat, is driven by gas-producing bacteria in the gut and becomes visibly obvious, sometimes within a day or two in warm conditions, as the body's abdomen distends. The third, active decay, is where the body loses mass most rapidly and where marbling of the kind described above tends to become most visible, followed by advanced decay and, eventually, skeletonization, though that final stage is generally weeks or months away under most conditions and essentially irrelevant to a body recovered within days. Water changes this timeline meaningfully. Submersion tends to slow bacterial decomposition compared to open air in summer heat, largely because cooler water temperatures suppress bacterial activity, but it accelerates certain skin changes, like the washerwoman skin effect, that don't occur the same way in a body left exposed to open air. A forensic pathologist reading a body recovered from a partially wet, partially dry environment like a beach where a body sits half in sand and half in water, actually has to account for two different decomposition clocks running at different speeds on two different parts of the same body, which is one more reason a definitive read on a marking like the one on the back of Nolan's head isn't something a first, cursory look can reliably deliver. Mississippi Gulf Coast summers add their own aggressive multiplier to all of this. Early July on the Mississippi Sound routinely brings ambient temperatures well into the 90s, combined with the kind of dense, near-saturating humidity typical of the deep South coastline, conditions forensic literature consistently identifies as among the fastest accelerating for decomposition anywhere in the continental United States, rivaled only by a handful of other especially hot, humid regions. A body exposed to open air and direct sun in that kind of heat can progress through early decomposition stages meaningfully faster than the same body would in a cooler, drier climate, sometimes by a significant margin within just the first day or two. That climate reality is part of the backdrop against which every forensic estimate in this case has to be read. It's precisely the kind of environmental variable a forensic pathologist has to account for and adjust their timeline around, and precisely why a body recovered from this specific stretch of coastline, in early July, might present in a state of change that would look considerably more advanced than an untrained observer, working from television's general sense of what a day-old body should look like, might expect. The third possibility, and the one that drives the entire foul play question, is blunt force trauma, an actual injury to that specific area of the head, sustained either before death, at the moment of death, or in its immediate aftermath, that produced localized internal bleeding beneath the skin. This is the possibility that would require real investigation to either confirm or rule out, and it's specifically the possibility that a cursory first-look examination, of the kind performed in that conference room meeting on day one, would not be equipped to definitively exclude. Distinguishing genuine blunt force injury from lividity or marbling generally requires a trained forensic pathologist making a careful incision into the discolored tissue during a full autopsy, examining what lies beneath at a cellular level, because externally, to the naked eye, all three can look unsettlingly similar. It's genuinely significant and worth stating plainly that two separate medical examiners reportedly looked at this same marking and were unable to reach a confident, shared conclusion about which of these three explanations actually applies. That's not necessarily evidence of incompetence, and it's not necessarily evidence of a cover-up either. Forensic science, contrary to how it's often portrayed in television dramas, frequently produces genuinely ambiguous findings, particularly in cases involving water recovery and multi-day decomposition, where the physical evidence has already been altered by the environment before an examiner ever gets a chance to look at it. But ambiguity in a finding this significant is not the same thing as resolution, and a family sitting with two experts who can't agree is a family who has every reasonable right to keep pushing for a clearer answer, through a second independent pathologist, through continued pressure on the original investigating agency, through exactly the kind of public attention this broadcast exists to generate. Now let's talk honestly about how a case like this typically moves forward from this exact point procedurally, because it's a question viewers ask constantly and it deserves a real general answer rather than vague reassurance. When an initial cause and manner of death can't be conclusively determined from a single examination, and when a family has retained independent counsel and sought a second forensic opinion, the case typically enters what investigators sometimes informally call a holding pattern, technically still open, technically still active, but without a clear, obvious next investigative step until either new physical evidence emerges, a witness comes forward with new information, or the second, independent forensic examination produces a finding that conflicts meaningfully with the first one. If the second, independent pathologist's findings do conflict with the original examiner's conclusions, That discrepancy itself often becomes the basis for renewed pressure on the original agency to reopen or expand its investigation, sometimes leading to a grand jury review, which is a process where a panel of citizens examines the available evidence, in this jurisdiction and many others, to determine whether it supports proceeding toward criminal charges, without that panel itself determining guilt or innocence. Josh Gill referenced exactly this possibility on this broadcast, saying explicitly that the family and the broader community has to be prepared to accept whatever a grand jury, or whatever result ultimately determines, while also stating his own hope in almost the same breath, that the truth turns out to be an accident rather than something worse. That's not a contradiction. It's the same dual posture we talked about earlier applied at the level of an entire community rather than just one family. Genuinely hoping for the least painful explanation, while genuinely committing to accept and pursue whatever the actual evidence supports, wherever it leads. It's worth explaining briefly and in general terms what a grand jury actually is and isn't, because the phrase gets thrown around constantly in true crime coverage without much explanation of the mechanics behind it. A grand jury is not a trial jury, and it does not determine guilt or innocence. It's a panel of ordinary citizens convened separately from any trial, whose sole job is to review the evidence a prosecutor presents and decide whether that evidence meets the legal threshold of probable cause. Essentially, whether there's enough here to justify moving forward with formal criminal charges at all. The proceedings are typically closed to the public and to the press, conducted without a judge presiding in the room the way one would at trial, and without the accused or their defense attorney present to cross-examine witnesses, which is a deliberate structural choice meant to let prosecutors present an unfiltered case for the specific, narrow question of whether charges are warranted. A grand jury can return what's called a true bill, meaning it agrees there's enough evidence to proceed with an indictment, or a no bill, meaning it doesn't, in which case a case can still remain technically open, pending new evidence, without ever becoming a criminal prosecution. Understanding this distinction matters enormously for how a family and a community process the eventual outcome in a case like this one. A no bill from a grand jury is not the same statement as an official finding that nothing wrong happened. It's a statement specifically that the evidence gathered so far as presented didn't clear a particular legal bar. A bar that can shift entirely if new evidence, a new witness, or a revised forensic finding later comes to light. There's one more general legal point worth knowing because it directly bears on how much time this family, or this community, actually has to press for answers. In the overwhelming majority of American jurisdictions, there is no statute of limitations on murder. Lesser charges, certain kinds of fraud, many misdemeanors, all typically carry a window of years after which prosecution becomes legally impossible no matter what evidence later emerges. Homicide is treated differently, specifically because the harm is considered permanent and irreversible in a way the law has decided should never simply expire. Practically, that means if this case is ever ultimately determined to be a homicide, based on the second pathologist's findings, based on new witness testimony, based on anything that surfaces in response to the standing reward, prosecution would remain a live legal possibility not just this year, but 5 years from now, 20 years from now, decades from now if that's what it takes. That single legal fact is, in its own way, a form of hope this family gets to hold on to regardless of how slowly any individual piece of this process moves. Time itself is not the enemy here the way it would be for almost any other category of crime. Cold cases decades old have been solved and successfully prosecuted using evidence and forensic techniques that didn't even exist at the time of the original death, which is precisely why nothing about a slow-moving timeline here should be read as the door quietly closing. We want to take a moment here, because we're now roughly at the midpoint of what we know about this case, to talk about something a little larger than Nolan Wells specifically. If you've been sitting with this story so far and finding your chest tight, finding yourself thinking about your own kids, your own siblings, a young person in your own life who went out with friends for a holiday and came home late, or didn't answer a text for a few hours longer than usual, that reaction is not an overreaction. It's the entire reason stories like this one matter to people who have no personal connection to Nolan Wells, his mother, or Horn Island, Mississippi. Every parent who has ever waited up past a curfew, every sibling who has ever called a phone that rang and rang with no answer, carries some smaller, quieter version of exactly the fear Christine lived out in its worst possible form. That shared, universal vulnerability is why a case like this resonates so far beyond its own geography, and it's also exactly why continuing to pay attention, continuing to ask hard, respectful questions on this family's behalf actually matters, rather than being simply a form of entertainment. It's the same reason a stranger's gravel-lot 15 minutes can still knock the air out of someone watching from a couch 1,000 miles away, in a town that has never heard of Ocean Springs and never will, unless a story like this one carries it there. And that ongoing attention is the entire reason we're asking you again right now, if you haven't already, to subscribe to this channel. We only get to keep pulling threads like the ones we've pulled today: the identification process, the forensic ambiguity, the search and rescue operation itself, because enough people choose to follow this coverage closely enough that new developments actually reach them. If a witness comes forward, if the second forensic pathologist's findings become public, if a grand jury reaches a determination, subscribing with notifications turned on is the difference between hearing about it from us within hours and stumbling across it weeks later buried in someone else's recap. Take 5 seconds now. It genuinely helps keep pressure and attention on cases exactly like this one. Let's go back to the reporting itself, because there's more in Josh Gill's account worth unpacking, particularly around what happened in the days immediately following the coroner's office visit. He described the family's return to the home, the arrival of extended family and friends, and a detail that, on reflection, carries more emotional weight than it might seem to on first hearing. The family photos still up on the walls, the dog's leash still hanging by the door, the ordinary physical residue of a life that, from Nolan's own perspective inside that house, hadn't ended at all. He said he doesn't know exactly when it hits a family, the moment where the ordinary objects of a home stop being comforting reminders and start being unbearable evidence of absence, but he described watching it start to happen in real time, in Christine's face, as she walked back through her own front door. Grief researchers have a specific term for objects like these: the dog's leash, a bedroom left exactly as it was, a jacket still hanging on its hook. Linking objects, a concept first articulated by psychiatrists studying complicated grief, describing physical items that come to serve as a tangible connection between the living and the person they've lost. These objects occupy a strange, doubled emotional position. In the earliest days, they can feel unbearable, precisely because encountering them unexpectedly collapses the distance grief needs in order to be survivable at all. Later, often much later, many bereaved parents describe those same objects becoming something closer to treasured, deliberately preserved, a physical anchor to a relationship that hasn't actually ended just because the person is gone. Grief counselors generally caution against rushing a family toward any specific relationship with these objects, packing a room away too soon, or conversely insisting nothing be touched. There's no fixed timeline that applies to everyone, and what Nolan's room, his belongings, and that leash by the door mean to Christine today will very likely keep changing, in ways that have nothing to do with how the investigation resolves, for the rest of her life. There's a specific, well-documented phenomenon in grief psychology sometimes called the second wave of loss, distinct from the initial shock of receiving the news itself. The first wave, in the parking lot in the coroner's conference room, is often described by survivors as almost unreal, a kind of dissociative fog where the brain, in a documented and protective way, refuses to fully process the scale of what's happening because doing so all at once would be overwhelming. The second wave typically arrives later, often once the initial adrenaline has worn off, once the family has physically returned to the environment where the missing person's ordinary, daily presence is most deeply embedded: their childhood bedroom, their side of a shared closet, their spot at a dinner table. It's frequently this second wave, not the first phone call, that survivors describe as the moment grief actually fully arrives, because it's the moment abstract news becomes concrete, permanent physical absence. Grief researchers also document a related, longer-running pattern worth understanding, because it's relevant to a family like Christine's for the rest of their lives, not just the first weeks. What's often called an anniversary reaction, a documented tendency for grief symptoms, intrusive memories, and acute sadness to intensify predictably around certain dates: the anniversary of the death itself, a birthday, a major holiday the person once celebrated with the family. For most families, the 4th of July is a holiday of fireworks and cookouts and long summer evenings. For Christine's family, from this year forward, it will always also be the date her son died, meaning a nationally celebrated holiday itself has become, permanently, one of the hardest days on her calendar, arriving every single year whether she's ready for it or not, often preceded by weeks of anticipatory dread that grief researchers have found can be nearly as difficult as the anniversary day itself. This is one more layer of what makes ambiguous, unresolved loss so uniquely difficult to carry. An ordinary holiday, shared with the entire country, now permanently reorganized around one family's private catastrophe. Josh Gill's closing reflections on that day centered on something simple and in its own way, more powerful than any of the forensic detail. His stated ongoing commitment to the family, extending well past the search itself. He said explicitly that his organization remains available for anything the family might need, whether that's continued search resources on Horn Island, emotional support, or simply, in his words, a shoulder to cry on. That kind of long-tail commitment, well past the acute emergency phase of a search, is worth noting as a genuinely distinguishing feature of how serious volunteer search and rescue organizations operate. When they operate well, the relationship with a family they've helped doesn't end the moment a body is recovered. In many documented cases nationally, it continues for months or years afterward, through court proceedings, through anniversaries, through the slow, uneven, nonlinear process of a family rebuilding some version of a life around a loss that never fully resolves. Part of that ongoing commitment, in cases that draw significant public attention, often ends up including something families rarely anticipate going in, navigating the media itself. Victim advocacy professionals and experienced search and rescue leaders who end up serving as a family's informal public voice, the role Josh Gill has clearly stepped in to hear, generally learn, often through hard experience, the basic principles of protecting a grieving family from a press cycle that can otherwise consume them entirely, controlling which details get shared publicly and which stay private, managing the volume of media requests so a family isn't fielding a dozen interview asks a day on top of an active investigation, and simply being a buffer, a single trusted point of contact, so a family doesn't have to personally relive their worst day in front of a camera every time a new outlet wants a quote. That function, quiet and almost entirely uncredited, is every bit as much a part of search and rescue, in a high-profile case as the boats and the aircraft were in the first 48 hours. Let's now turn to something that came up directly in questioning during this broadcast, and that deserves careful, honest unpacking. The question of why exactly dental records were required to identify Nolan Wells at all, given that his mother, his father and numerous friends and extended family were present and available almost immediately. As explained earlier, visual identification requires a body to still look recognizably like the person it was in life. There's a common misconception, understandable but incorrect, that a family member looking at a body and saying, "That's him," is always sufficient definitive proof of identity, full stop. In reality, courts, medical examiners, and law enforcement agencies generally treat a family's visual identification as strong supporting evidence, particularly for internal case management purposes in the earliest hours, but not as the sole, final, legally definitive basis for an official death certificate or, especially, for anything that might eventually be presented in a criminal proceeding. Visual identification is also, and this is worth saying plainly, genuinely unreliable under conditions of extreme grief and stress. There are documented cases, rare but real, of grieving family members misidentifying a body under the influence of shock, expectation, and sheer emotional need for the search to be over, only for scientific methods to later reveal an error. This is precisely why medical examiner offices, even when a family is confident, generally still pursue a scientific method as the official final basis for identification, not because they doubt the family, but because the system is built to protect against exactly this kind of rare but devastating error. In this specific case, the progression from visual assessment to discussion of DNA collection to an eventual reliance on dental records tells a consistent, if unstated, story. The body's condition likely fell somewhere in a range where a confident visual identification wasn't considered sufficient on its own, where fingerprinting either wasn't attempted or wasn't viable, and where dental records ultimately provided the fastest reliable scientific confirmation available, faster than waiting on a full DNA analysis while still meeting the evidentiary bar the case required. We want to pause again here for a broader piece of context because it connects directly to something the forensic expert raised and that deserves a fuller explanation: how investigators actually determine scientifically how long a body has been in the water, and why that single number, if it can be determined with any precision, matters enormously to this case. Forensic pathologists and forensic entomologists, when a body is recovered from water, look at a cluster of physical indicators together, rather than relying on any single sign in isolation, to estimate what's sometimes called the post-mortem submersion interval. Skin changes like the washerwoman's skin effect mentioned earlier progress along a documented, roughly predictable timeline, though heavily influenced by water temperature. Adipocere formation, sometimes informally called grave wax, a waxy, soap-like substance that can form on body fat under specific cool, wet conditions, is another marker examiners look for, though it typically takes considerably longer to develop than the time frame usually discussed in a case like this one. Insect activity. If the body spent any time exposed to open air before or after being in the water, follows well-documented, temperature-dependent colonization patterns that forensic entomologists can use to narrow a window of time since death with meaningful precision, sometimes down to a matter of hours in ideal conditions. The science behind this is more precise than most people realize. Blowflies, drawn to a body within minutes of exposure to open air in warm weather, lay eggs in a specific, predictable sequence around natural openings in any wound sites, and those eggs progress through larval stages at rates so consistently tied to ambient temperature that an entomologist can often work backward from the size and developmental stage of the maggots present to calculate, with real scientific rigor, a fairly tight window for how long a body has been exposed to open air, entirely independent of anything the water itself can tell an examiner. In a case like this one, where a body was recovered partially on wet sand and partially in water, that insect evidence and the water-based evidence can potentially be read together, cross-checked against each other, to build a more complete and more confident timeline than either method could produce on its own. And internal indicators, visible only during a full autopsy, like the degree of internal organ decomposition and specific changes to lung tissue in drowning-related deaths, provide additional data points that, combined, allow examiners to narrow down not just how long a body was in water, but often to distinguish, with real scientific confidence, whether a person was alive when they entered the water at all, which is one of the single most important questions in any case where the manner of death is in genuine doubt. That last point deserves particular emphasis, because it's easy for public discussion of a case like this one to focus entirely on visible, external markings, the red mark that's driven so much of the conversation, while underappreciating that a full, completed autopsy is actually capable of answering a much more fundamental question. Was Nolan Wells alive or already deceased at the moment he entered the water? Diatoms, microscopic algae present in most natural bodies of water, are one specific forensic marker examiners sometimes look for internally, in organs like the lungs, kidneys, or bone marrow, because their presence deep inside those organs generally indicates the person was still breathing, and therefore still alive, when water entered their body, distinguishing a genuine drowning death from a scenario where a body was placed in water after death from some other cause. This is precisely the kind of internal laboratory-level finding that a cursory first-day examination in a coroner's conference room simply cannot provide, and precisely the kind of finding that makes a completed, full forensic autopsy, the process Josh Gill described the coroner explaining that day, so consequential to how this entire case ultimately resolves. None of this is offered as a claim about what actually happened to Nolan Wells specifically. We don't know, and as of this reporting, the full autopsy findings that would answer these exact questions haven't been made fully public. It's offered so that when those findings do eventually become public, whether through this family's own statements, through their attorney, through the second independent pathologist's report, or through official channels, you'll understand exactly what those findings mean and why they matter, rather than hearing a term like diatom testing or post-mortem submersion interval, and having no framework for what it actually tells investigators. It's also worth understanding honestly why findings like these can take so long to actually reach a family, because the delay is rarely a sign of neglect. The United States has faced a well-documented, worsening shortage of board-certified forensic pathologists for years, with the total number of practicing forensic pathologists nationally falling well short of what national medical associations have identified as adequate staffing to handle the volume of death investigations required across the country. That shortage means many medical examiner and coroner offices operate with real structural backlogs, sometimes months long for toxicology results, specialized testing, and even the completed written autopsy report itself, entirely independent of how complicated or straightforward any individual case actually is. A family waiting weeks or months for final answers in a case like this one isn't necessarily waiting because something is being deliberately withheld. Often, they're simply waiting in a genuine, nationally documented queue, behind a workload that has outpaced the number of qualified professionals available to handle it. Let's turn back one more time to Christine because this story at its core has always been about her at least as much as it's been about the forensic mechanics of her son's death. Josh Gill, describing her overall demeanor in the weeks since, used a phrase that deserves to be the emotional through line of this entire episode. There's no playbook for a grieving mother who doesn't know what happened to her son. He said it more than once in slightly different words across the conversation, and it's worth taking seriously as something more than a comforting platitude. Every family who loses a child to a clear, understood cause, illness, a diagnosed accident, even a witnessed crime with an identified perpetrator already in custody, still faces years of grief work, but they at least face it with a stable, no narrative to grieve around. Christine doesn't have that. She is grieving her son and simultaneously still actively investigating the circumstances of his death, two enormous, exhausting undertakings that most people are never asked to carry at the same time, let alone within the same week, the same conversation, sometimes the same sentence. There are, thankfully, organizations built specifically around this exact form of grief, and naming them here is worth doing plainly without dressing it up, for any parent watching who is living through something similar right now, tonight, in a house that suddenly feels too quiet. The Compassionate Friends, a national nonprofit support organization specifically for grieving parents, siblings, and grandparents, has operated local chapters across the country for decades, built entirely around the specific, isolating grief of losing a child, regardless of the child's age or the circumstances of their death. Its core insight, echoed by grief researchers generally, is that parental bereavement is different in kind, not just degree, from most other forms of loss, and that grieving parents often benefit most from sitting with other grieving parents, specifically, people who don't need the loss explained to them, who already understand the particular, unspeakable weight of it without being told. For a family navigating both grief and an unresolved investigation simultaneously, exactly Christine's situation, a support structure built around other parents who have lived through the death of a child, rather than one built around the specifics of any one case, can offer something the investigation itself never will. A room full of people who already understand, without a single word of explanation needed, exactly what it costs to keep breathing through a day like this one. It's worth ending this thought on something researchers have found sits directly alongside all of this pain, not as a replacement for it but as a genuine, well-documented companion to it. Post-traumatic growth, a body of psychological research describing the specific, positive psychological change some people experience in the aftermath of profound adversity, not instead of grief or trauma, but running in parallel with it. Researchers studying bereaved parents specifically have found that a meaningful number over years report a deepened sense of personal purpose, closer relationships with the people who stood by them, and strikingly, exactly the kind of outward-facing compassion toward other suffering families that Christine has already demonstrated toward Jadarius Minweathers, months into her own unresolved grief. This isn't a claim that anything about losing a child is redemptive, and it never should be framed that way. It's simply an honest acknowledgement that the human capacity for growth alongside devastation is real, well-documented, and worth knowing exists for Christine and for anyone else listening who is living through their own version of that same impossible weight, even on the nights when believing it feels genuinely out of reach. He said she still cries to this day. He said it plainly, without elaboration, the way you'd state a simple fact rather than a dramatic flourish, and it's worth taking it exactly that plainly. Grief doesn't resolve on a television timeline. It doesn't wrap up neatly at the end of an episode, or a season, or even necessarily a legal proceeding, however that proceeding eventually concludes. If a grand jury reaches a determination tomorrow, Christine still has to live every single day after that determination as a mother without her son. That fact sits underneath everything else this case is about, underneath every forensic detail, every expert disagreement about wave patterns and dental records and subcutaneous markings, and it's worth never losing sight of it, because it's the only fact in this entire story that isn't actually in dispute. Modern grief research has actually moved away from the old, once popular idea that healthy grieving means reaching a fixed point called closure, a clean severing of the bond with the person who died so the living person can fully move on. Contemporary bereavement researchers largely favor a different framework now, known as continuing bonds, which holds that healthy long-term grieving doesn't require letting go of the relationship at all. It involves finding a new, sustainable way to carry that relationship forward, through memory, through ritual, through exactly the kind of ongoing tears Josh Gill described, without that continued attachment being treated as a sign that someone is failing to heal properly. By that framework, Christine crying to this day isn't evidence she's stuck or unwell, or failing some unspoken grief timetable. It's evidence of an ongoing bond with her son that grief researchers would now consider a healthy, expected, permanent feature of her life going forward, not a problem in need of fixing. She is not supposed to be done crying about Nolan. Nobody who loved him is. It's worth pausing on why a family in Christine's position chooses to go public at all, rather than grieving entirely privately, because it's rarely a simple or comfortable decision. Victim advocacy professionals who counsel families through exactly this choice describe it as a genuine trade-off, weighed carefully rather than entered into lightly. Going public means surrendering a real measure of privacy during the most painful period of a family's life, opening themselves and their son up to public commentary from strangers who will never fully understand what he actually meant to them, in exchange for something that private grief alone cannot offer: sustained public pressure on an investigation, a wider net for potential witnesses, and a platform loud enough that it can't simply be quietly closed out and forgotten. Families who make this choice are, in a very real sense, making a calculated trade, absorbing a real cost to themselves in the hope of a real benefit to the case, and that trade deserves to be named and respected rather than taken for granted every time a grieving parent agrees to sit for an interview or authorize someone like Josh Gill to speak on their behalf. Because that trade is real, it's worth being a genuinely careful, discerning viewer of coverage like this across the board, not only for this case. Before treating any detail in an unfolding case as settled fact, it's worth asking a few simple questions. Is this coming from someone with direct, first-hand knowledge like Josh Gill describing what he personally witnessed, or is it second-hand speculation dressed up as insider information? Is a claimed expert credential actually verifiable, the way Jeff Gentry's published work and professional certifications are? And is a source willing to say "we don't know yet," when that's genuinely the honest answer, the way this case's own forensic panel did about that unexplained marking, rather than manufacturing false certainty simply because uncertainty makes for a less satisfying headline? Cases like this one deserve exactly that kind of careful attention from their audience, the same rigor we've tried to apply throughout this episode, because a family's real, ongoing search for the truth is poorly served by an audience willing to accept anything less. We also want to be careful, here, about something that matters in any case receiving this much public attention: the difference between healthy public scrutiny and unhealthy public speculation. Public attention on a case like this one serves a genuinely important function. It can pressure agencies to allocate resources they might not otherwise prioritize. It can encourage witnesses who might otherwise stay silent to come forward. And it gives families like Christine's a platform and a support network they wouldn't have access to on their own. But that same attention, unchecked, has a well-documented dark side. Cases that generate significant online interest frequently attract amateur theorizing that hardens within days into stated as fact accusations against specific named individuals with no actual evidentiary basis, purely because those individuals happen to be near the person who died, or because their social media presence struck online commenters as somehow suspicious. Families in cases like this one have, in numerous documented instances nationally, describe this kind of speculative pylon as a genuinely separate trauma layered on top of the original loss, one where they find themselves not only grieving but also fielding harassment directed at friends, acquaintances, or even completely uninvolved bystanders who got swept up in online speculation. Responsible coverage of a case like Nolan Wells's means asking hard questions of the actual evidence, the actual forensic ambiguity, the actual process, while deliberately not participating in naming or accusing specific individuals absent real, disclosed evidence, a distinction this broadcast has tried to hold to throughout, and one worth holding on to as a viewer scrolling through comment sections and theories online as well. Online amateur sleuthing communities have grown enormously over the past decade, built around forums and social platforms where users compile timelines, cross-reference social media posts, and occasionally surface genuinely useful information law enforcement hadn't yet found. A real, documented phenomenon, not a myth, with cases nationally where crowdsourced attention has helped move a stalled investigation forward. But the same structure that occasionally produces a genuine breakthrough produces, far more often, a kind of runaway groupthink where an early, plausible-sounding theory gets repeated, elaborated on, and treated as increasingly confirmed simply through repetition and community consensus, with no actual new evidence entering the picture at any point along the way. Researchers who study online misinformation call this a confirmation cascade, and it moves fast. A theory posted with appropriate hedging language, just a thought, could be nothing, frequently loses that hedging entirely within a few rounds of resharing, until it's being repeated elsewhere as flatly established fact. For a family like Christine's, watching a real loss get processed this way by strangers online, watching people who've never met any of them build entire narratives about their private grief, adds a specific modern layer of cruelty to an already unbearable situation, one earlier generations of grieving families never had to contend with at this scale. At the same time, there's a very real and legitimate role for public pressure in cases where a family believes an investigation may be moving too slowly, or where physical evidence, like an unexplained subcutaneous marking two examiners can't agree on, seems to warrant more scrutiny than it initially received. The reward being offered in this case, $125,000 for information regarding what happened on Horn Island, is itself a direct signal of how seriously this is being treated at an investigative level, regardless of what the eventual manner of death determination turns out to be. Rewards of that size are not offered in cases law enforcement considers closed or fully explained. They're offered specifically to surface information from people who may have witnessed something, however small, and who haven't yet come forward, whether out of fear, uncertainty about the significance of what they saw, or simple reluctance to get involved. Reward funds of this size in an active investigation typically come from some combination of sources: a state or local law enforcement reward account, contributions from established organizations like Crime Stoppers chapters that maintain standing reward infrastructure specifically for cases like this, and, increasingly common in high-profile cases, private or family-organized contributions layered on top of whatever official funds already exist. Whatever the exact composition of this particular fund, the underlying mechanism is the same one that's existed for decades in American law enforcement. Money changes the calculus for someone sitting on a piece of information they're not sure matters, giving a person one more concrete reason to make the call they might otherwise talk themselves out of making. It's worth knowing briefly why tip lines like this one are structured the way they are, because a lot of people who genuinely have relevant information stay silent for reasons that have nothing to do with the value of what they know. Anonymous tip systems exist specifically because researchers studying witness cooperation have found, consistently, that fear of retaliation, fear of getting a friend or acquaintance in trouble, or simple fear of becoming entangled in a long legal process are among the most common reasons people who saw something relevant choose not to come forward voluntarily. A properly run tip line is built to remove exactly those barriers. A caller doesn't have to give a name, doesn't have to commit to testifying, doesn't have to know for certain that what they saw matters. They just have to say what they saw. Investigators are trained to take even a fragmentary, uncertain tip seriously, because in case after documented case nationally, the detail that ultimately broke an investigation open wasn't a dramatic confession. It was one ordinary person mentioning something they'd almost talked themselves out of calling in at all, convinced it probably wasn't important enough to bother anyone with. If you know anything, if you were on Horn Island on the 4th of July, if you have even a small, seemingly insignificant detail about who Nolan was with, what happened that day, or anything that might connect to that reward, the number to call has been provided throughout this broadcast, and it's worth repeating here: 228-769-3063. You don't need to be certain your information matters. Investigators, not you, are the ones equipped to determine what's significant, and small details that seem unimportant to an ordinary person watching from home have, in case after documented case, turned out to be the single piece that moved an investigation forward. We want to close, before we get to what's still ahead in this case, by returning one more time to that image from the very beginning of this story. A mother and a stranger sitting together on the gravel of a boat launch parking lot, because neither one of them could stand. It would be easy to tell this story focused entirely on tide charts and dental records and subcutaneous markings, and all of that matters, all of it deserves the scrutiny it's received and will continue to receive. But underneath every forensic detail is the same plain fact we opened with. A mother's son is gone, and she still doesn't have a complete answer for why. Whatever a grand jury eventually determines, whatever a second forensic pathologist's report eventually says, whatever new witness might still come forward in response to that reward, none of it will undo the fact that Christine has to keep living every ordinary day, past family photos still on the wall and a dog's leash still by the door, as a mother without her son. Ocean Springs is a small coastal community, the kind of place where a young man's disappearance doesn't stay contained within one family's grief for long. It ripples outward through a school, a workplace, a church congregation, a boating community that all overlap with each other in the way they tend to in towns of that size. Sociologists who study community response to a single high-profile local tragedy describe a specific pattern in places like this: collective grief that shows up in oddly concrete, practical ways, a noticeable dip in ordinary town gossip and small talk for weeks, local businesses quietly donating toward a search effort or a fundraiser without being asked, a shared, town-wide hyper-awareness around specific dates and anniversaries that a larger city would simply never register in the same way. A tragedy like this one doesn't just belong to Christine's household. It becomes, for a period of time, something an entire small community carries together, which is part of why the language used earlier in this broadcast about praying for the nation and specifically for Ocean Springs wasn't just a rhetorical flourish. In a town that size, the loss really is communal in a way it rarely is anywhere larger. That's why we keep telling this story. Not because the mechanics of forensic identification are inherently fascinating, though they are genuinely important to understand, but because a family in Ocean Springs is still waiting for a complete, honest answer, and public attention, respectful, careful, evidence-based public attention, is one of the very few tools available to help make sure that answer actually comes. Think back one more time to that gravel parking lot. Not because we want to dwell on the pain of it for its own sake, but because everything this episode has walked through since, the dental records, the lividity, the marbling, the drift patterns, the grand jury process, the wrongful death track running quietly alongside the criminal one, all of it exists downstream of that single moment. A mother's body giving out from under her before her mind had even finished catching up to what her heart already knew. Every forensic term we've unpacked tonight is, in the end, just a more precise language for describing exactly what happened to that one family, on that one morning at that one boat launch. It's easy, in an episode this dense with process and mechanism, to lose the person at the center of it, and we didn't want to let that happen here. Christine is not a case number. She is not a data point in a national statistic about drowning deaths on holiday weekends. She is a nurse practitioner, a wife, a mother who still, by every account, prays every day, who still asks after other families' missing sons even while living inside her own unresolved loss, who still, as Josh Gill told us plainly, cries to this day. If you take one thing from this episode beyond the forensic detail, let it be this. The next time you see a missing persons flyer, a GoFundMe for a stranger's funeral, a local news segment about a body recovered from a lake or a beach in some town you've never been to, there is very likely a version of that gravel parking lot sitting behind it, a version of that 15 minutes on the ground, a version of a mother or a father whose legs simply stopped working the moment the call came in. Most of those families will never get a national broadcast asking pointed questions on their behalf. Most of them will grieve in something much closer to silence. The fact that Christine's story reached this many people isn't a measure of how much her son mattered more than any other missing person's son or daughter. It's mostly an accident of circumstance. The same accident of circumstance we talked about earlier in this episode. What she's asking for, in the end, is exactly what any of those quieter families are asking for too. The truth, however long it takes to get there, and the chance to finally stop asking the question so she can go back to simply being someone's mother instead of a case that never quite closes. Before we go, one more time. If this case matters to you the way it's clearly mattered to everyone who has followed it closely enough to still be listening at this point, subscribe to this channel now, and make sure your notifications are turned on. We will keep covering every development in this case as it happens, the grand jury process if and when it moves forward, the second pathologist's findings if and when they become public, any new witness who comes forward in response to that reward. The only way to make sure you see it the moment it happens, rather than finding out secondhand weeks later, is to be subscribed right now, before you move on to whatever comes next in your feed. We'll leave you tonight with the same image we started with. A young man found half in the sand and half in the water, on a beach where the water should never have reached him at all. A mother who knew before anyone told her exactly what that meant. And a case that is still, as of tonight, not finished asking its questions. If you know anything about what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island, please call it in. And if you're the praying kind, Christine could use it tonight, same as she has every night since the 4th of July. We'll keep watching this one closely for as long as it takes. We hope you will too. Good night and thank you for staying with us.